I really don't know where to start with all of this. I feel like I'm going to wake up any minute now and all will be back to normal. Deep in my stomach, there's a knot that reminds me that's impossible. All this over a trip I didn't even want to make. Let me explain before I continue to ramble off, leaving you more confused. I got the devastating phone call a couple weeks ago informing me that my great-aunt, Leona, had passed away. She was older with many health issues, but it was still shocking and it hurt. She was all I really had as a parental figure growing up. My mess of a family is another story, but I'll spare you those details. I left to work at a prestigious law firm a few hours away a couple of years ago, and had honestly not visited her or kept in touch with her as much as I wanted or should have. I went back to my hometown for her funeral. It was then that I learned she had left me her home and the small plot of land it sat on. Aunt Leona had lived in an assisted living community the last few years, so it had been a long time since I, or anyone for that matter, had been there. It's a small 2-story home out in the middle of nowhere. While she provided me with so much love in that house as I was growing up, it still gave me the creeps. I can remember waking up to knocking different times in the night, hearing my name being whispered in my ear. I could have sworn I seen a tall old man glaring at me from the top of the stairs once. I would mention these things to Aunt Leona, and she would just smile and tell me, "Do not fear, they are here for us." As I got older, I realized my aunt was a little off, I guess people would say. Regardless, she was an amazing woman, and I loved her dearly. Back to the present and why I'm pouring my guts out to strangers on the internet. I didn't want the house and planned to sell it. I knew it would need work before it could go on the market, and that required me to go there and see just how much. I took additional time from work and finally forced myself to go to the house today. As I pulled into the very overgrown yard, I immediately felt dread. I didn't want to get out of the car. I wanted to go back to the city and just forget the house even existed. Another little part of me knew that's not what my aunt would have wanted. She loved the house, and I owed it to her to fix it up and let someone else care for it if I wouldn't. I was thankful for my jeans as I walked through the mess of weeds onto the old creaky porch. I pulled out the small set of keys I was given and went to unlock the door when a rough voice stopped me. "That's not something I would do if I were you." I nearly jumped out of my skin as I turned to see an old lady grinning at me. After a moment of pure terror, I recognized her as my aunt's longtime neighbor, Frances. She too scared me as a child, but my aunt always reassured me she meant no harm. She lived nearly a mile down the isolated road, but would regularly walk to our house to chat with my aunt on the porch. I never remembered her actually entering the house. I was quite surprised she was still living and able to walk the distance to the house. "Frances, it's been a long time. Good to see you again." I smiled at her, trying to hide how uncomfortable I was. She continued to stare at me with an almost toothless grin. Leona never would listen. She only lived as long as she did because she got out of the old curse. She must be disturbed, I thought to myself. Aunt Leona loved it here, hated to leave it, was all I could respond with. Just as I was about to ask what she was doing walking around here still, she turned to leave. "Beware, girl," she called as she started back towards the road, never looking back at me. "Woman is delusional," I muttered to myself as I turned back to the door and heard the lock flick and felt the knob turn in my hand. I stepped into the small living room to see everything as I remembered it, just with a lot more dust. The old rocking chair still sat in the right corner of the room. The old and worn-out burgundy couch stretched along the wall beside of it. Old coffee mugs sat on the tiny wooden coffee table. I was honestly stunned that no one had broken in after all the years it sat vacant, where it didn't appear that anyone had at least. I went through the bottom floor, everything still in their rightful places. I looked at the old pictures on the walls. My heart ached when I saw a picture from my high school graduation. Aunt Leona's arm was wrapped around me in my gold cap and gown, both of us smiling. I recalled how proud she was. I went up the old stairs. Almost every step groaned beneath my feet, and I worried I may fall through. A vision of the creepy tall old guy I really thought I had once seen flashed through my head, and I felt the goosebumps instantly raise on my skin. I couldn't think like that. I had a job to do, and I wasn't a silly little girl anymore. I made it to the top floor with no issues. I entered my old room. My twin-sized bed was still there, along with all my old stuffed animals. Posters were still taped to the walls, though they too were dusty and faded. Overall, the inside of the house was in better shape than I imagined. Other than needing a few repairs and a major deep cleaning, the most of my work would take place on the outside of the house. I made my way back down to the bottom floor. I re-entered the living room when something caught my eye. There was a newspaper on the coffee table. I didn't remember seeing when I first walked in. Curious, I walked over and noticed it really stuck out from everything else in the house. This looked brand new, as if it had just been delivered recently. There wasn't a speck of dust on the paper. Not only that, but the paper was opened, like someone had been reading it. This is where I messed up. This is why I'm so angry with myself. I picked the paper up, wanting to examine the contents. My eyes immediately landed on obituaries in bold letters going across the top of the second page. I felt my eyes drop lower on the large page, looking at the different pictures until my eyes froze and I felt my blood run ice cold. There was my picture, not just any picture, a very recent headshot that was professionally taken of me at my work. My full name was typed below my picture. "What?" I whispered to myself as I stared at the lengthy description under my name and picture. Kayleen was a ray of sunshine taken too soon from this world on September 1st, 2023 in a tragic accident in her hometown of Appalachia, Virginia. My heart stopped. Obviously, that date hasn't happened yet. I felt my palms get sweaty as I started to shake. I couldn't even finish reading as my vision went blurry. I dropped the newspaper on the floor as I darted to the front door. At first, the doorknob refused to budge. I frantically twisted and pulled at the old rusty metal piece. My ears began to ring as the panic fully took over me. I felt as if someone was after me, coming up behind me quickly, and I was just cornered prey. Just as I was about to start kicking furiously at the door, the knob gave way and the door flung open. I ran faster than I've ever run to my vehicle, not even caring I left the door open. I jumped into the driver's seat, thankful my car is a push to start, and floored it back down the lonely road. I'm now sitting in a hotel room in the main part of this dreadful town. I considered going back to my city, but I'm truly in no shape to drive. I've thought of everything. Surely it's a dirty joke being played on me. I considered old lady Frances, but I highly doubt she had the resources or skill to create such a perfect copy of a newspaper. Maybe one of the cruel bullies from my childhood still lives around here, and did this to mess with me, knowing I'd be coming here after the death of my aunt. Word travels fast in small towns. Regardless of all the logical reasons I've come up with, a part of me not only feels terrified but actually believes this stupid piece of paper. I've decided I'm going back home in the morning and I will not return. Despite all the questions and all the feelings of me needing to go back for answers, I won't. I'm going back to my apartment, and I will not leave my home for any reason on September 1st. It can't happen if I don't come back here, right? Just as the title states, I clean abandoned houses for a living. I am quite proud of myself as I have worked hard starting my own business at just 24 years old and building it to what it is now. I specifically targeted these types of cleaning jobs, as you can charge much more than your average 1 to 3 times per week house cleaning jobs of inhabited homes. Plus, I rarely ever have to see anyone other than my team while on the job. Over the years, I have really been in some insane situations with these houses. Everything from encountering wild animals to once a deranged squatter taking up residence in the homes I clean. There is one house that stands out from the rest. However, one that haunts my dreams to this day. I got the job offer through a real estate agent I made my friend over the years in this business. It's a small home, not much clutter left. Amila, my real estate friend, said over the phone, "Shouldn't need more than 1 or 2 of you to complete the clean," she continued in her enthusiastic voice. I rolled my eyes. I hated when she used her customer service voice on me. Yeah. What's the real deal with this house?" I answered in my usual half-annoyed tone. Amelia responded more normal this time. "Honestly, Lori, this house gives me the creeps. The granddaughter inherited it a couple of years ago, but has just recently decided to sell. The grandmother apparently died in the house." I rolled my eyes again. Death in the houses I cleaned was nothing new to me, and Amelia was well aware of this. Amelia continued, "I cut my pre-visit to the house short last week. Didn't even make it upstairs where the grandmother apparently passed. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming in this one. That got my attention. Amelia had been in real estate longer than I had been in the cleaning business, and she took her pre-get-to-know-before-showing visits very seriously. Anyway, I recommended your cleaning services to the granddaughter, and she agreed right away. Do you accept? She finished. Yes, I accept the job. How soon can we get in to clean? I answered, feeling somewhat excited. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. As I mentioned, the granddaughter removed most of the clutter from the house, but it still needs a good TLC cleaning. The key will be left under the welcome mat, Amelia said, back in her customer service voice. My eyes rolled yet again as I ended the call. Finally an interesting cleans, I thought, as I then dialed Morgan. The next day, my most trusted cleaner and best friend Morgan and myself drove up the horribly overgrown driveway and saw the well-aged small house come into view. Surely they will need to hire an outside maintenance and renovation crews, I thought as I climbed out of my cleaning van. Morgan whistled as we stepped on the small creaking porch. You sure just you and I can handle this, Lori? Morgan asked as I fetched the house key from the weathered porch mat. If the outside is anything like the inside, we need the whole damn team, Morgan stated as she stood behind me. Amelia is over the top, but would never underestimate a cleaning job, I answered as I slid the house key into the old lock and turned until I heard the lock give way. I then pushed the door open as it made the usual ominous creak. We were both silent as we stepped into what I assumed was a small living room. The musty smell of a far too long closed-up house filled my nose as my eyes scanned the darkened room. Just as Amelia said, not much was left in the room. A couch took up most of the room on the right. A small wooden coffee table sat directly in front of it, coated in a thick layer of dust. I noticed a few photographs still clung to the walls. Let's get the supplies from the back of the van and get started, I said over my shoulder to Morgan. I have dinner plans and want this done long before. A bit later, I was scrubbing the dirty windows of the living room, while Morgan opted to start upstairs. Lori, I heard Morgan call from up the stairs located just behind me. What? I called back. It was silent for several minutes as I waited for a response. I felt my aggravation growing as Morgan did not respond. I threw my rag on the floor and wiped my sweating brow as I turned and headed towards the stairs. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed to the upper floor. You better have a damn good reason for interrupting me and not answering, I yelled as I reached the final step. Goosebumps covered my skin when I stepped onto the old wooden floor of the upper level. Weird. I mumbled to myself as I looked around. The upper level was a small hallway. 2 rooms were located on each side as I peered down the dark corridor. Morgan, I called in a softer voice this time. No answer. I slowly headed down the hallway, wishing I had thought to bring my flashlight. I always hated working with no electricity, but it came with the job. I could see the light of day from the open door on left side of the hall. The other door on the right was closed. As I looked into the open door on the left, I saw Morgan standing still looking at the bed, located on the far side of the room. It moved, Morgan said in an almost whisper. Huh? I answered as I walked in and stood beside her. The bed. It moved on its own while I was cleaning the floor, Morgan said, still staring down at the bed. I then noticed the bed was crooked now. The bottom was several inches away from the wall where the top was still flush with the corner of wall. Do you see it? Morgan then said, even softer now. I almost couldn't hear her. Instead of questioning her, I looked down towards the bed that her eyes were glued to. I instantly saw what she was talking about. There was an imprint on the bed, the shape of a body, as if someone was laying on the bed that very moment. The chills were really covering my body now, and I felt myself actually shivering. It felt like someone was staring up at us directly from the bed. I slowly reached for Morgan's arm and gently pulled her towards me. Let's go back downstairs. We will finish the bottom floor together, I said, matching her whispering tone. Morgan didn't respond but obeyed my request. The feeling of eyes on us did not leave as we headed down the small hallway to the top of the stairs. I had to fight the urge to run down the flimsy steps. Once we were safely down in the living room, the air somehow felt easier to breathe, if that makes any sense. What the hell was that? Morgan demanded, finally sounding more like herself. I ignored that question. Look, you know I hate skimming on jobs, but let's get this level done and get the hell out of here. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and headed to the next room, which was a small kitchen. Morgan stayed close beside me as we worked in silence cleaning the sink, counter, and cabinets. We both froze after hearing what sounded like footsteps above us. "Don't," I said in a warning tone. As I went back to cleaning dust and mice droppings from the cabinet, Morgan again obeyed and stayed silent as she went back to work on the counter. The footsteps continued moving around above us, on and off, as we quickly finished in the kitchen. The last room branched off from the kitchen that appeared to be a small office. I was so relieved we would be out of there soon. This room had stained and worn down carpet covering the wooden floor. I turned on our rechargeable vacuum, and the loud buzzing sound almost deafened me, but I was glad for it. Working in eerie silence was not normal for us, as we usually chatted and listened to music, but I was too rushed to fool with conversation or a playlist right now. "What the actual hell?" I heard Morgan yell out over the sound of the vacuum. I jerked my head up to see Morgan staring up at the ceiling, looking terrified again. Just as I cut the vacuum off, I heard what she had to be referring to as the buzzing sound died down. I can only explain it as the choking or coughing, gurgling sound of an elderly person. It was only for a split second I heard it, but that was enough. "Screw this," I yelled as I grabbed up as many of our supplies as I could. Morgan joined me in grabbing up the rest. We dashed out of the office through the kitchen and living room, and out the front door. I was pretty much sprinting to the van while trying not to trip on the mess of the yard. Just as I got to the van, I heard Morgan shout, "Wait." I turned to see her a few feet behind me. I left my supplies upstairs. We also didn't finish cleaning up there. We didn't even clean the bathroom, which must be up there. "I'm not charging the freaking client. We can buy new whatever supplies are left. Get your ass in the van." I didn't wait for a response. As I jumped into the driver's seat, Morgan hurried and threw the supplies in her arms in the back and slammed the door. I took one final look at the house as she slid into the passenger seat. I couldn't be sure, but it almost looked like someone was peering out of one of the two upper windows. I started the van. Hearing it roar to life was pure heaven in that moment. I floored it out of the driveway and back into town. I later called Amelia to explain the job was not complete and I would not be charging. The granddaughter would have to find someone else to clean that nightmare. This has been a couple of months ago, and I was not kidding when I said this horrid house still haunts my dreams. It was only last night I dreamt I was in a bed, staring up at an old, cracked, and familiar ceiling. I felt weak and frail as the weight of someone crawling on top of me took the air from my lungs. I felt cold hands around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter, that awful gurgling, choking sound coming from my mouth being the last thing I heard as I woke up in a cold sweat. The marks are still visible on my throat today. When my husband and I first got married, we moved into an old house he inherited. The home was originally built in the early 1920s and definitely had visible age and history. Granted, my husband had been working on remodeling the house and made a decent amount of progress by the time we moved in. The renovation needs were not what plagued me the most about this house. I never really liked the feeling the house gave me, but I chalked it up to me knowing how old the house was and knowing a couple members of my husband's family had passed in the house. I'll skip all the cliche experiences, feelings of being watched, feeling not alone when you were alone, and such, and get into one experience that even had my husband baffled. He and I had settled into bed, said our goodnights, and were well on our way to falling asleep when we heard movement upstairs. At first, I didn't move or say anything. I thought I had imagined it, until the sound of footsteps above us got louder. My husband sat straight up saying, "You hear that too, right?" I was pretty much shaking and mumbled, of course, as it sounded like the footsteps were running across the upper floor. My husband hopped out of bed, ran out the door and up the stairs. A few minutes later, my husband came back down the stairs into our bedroom and shut the door. At first, he didn't answer when I asked what was it. After prying at him again, he simply said, "I'm sure it's just my great-grandmother checking in on us." She was one of the family members who had passed away in the house, but I was not convinced. This didn't feel like a friendly family ghost just visiting. It felt plain malicious to me. After that night, I started often hearing the sounds of movement upstairs when no one was up there. Then the distinctive squeaking noise our stairs made when someone was walking on them started happening when I was alone downstairs. I can still feel the chills all over me when I'd hear this right behind me while sitting on the couch in the downstairs living room. My friend had the bright idea to buy me a Ouija board to use in the house. After telling her some of what I was experiencing, she was dying to try and see if anything would make contact. I flat out refused, but did keep the board upon her, insisting I may at some point want to try it. I took the board still in its box and placed it on a shelf at the top of a small linen closet we had. I shut the closet door with every intention of forgetting the board was even there. However, after this, that closet door never stayed shut. I would find it half opened almost every time I walked by it. I started thinking I wasn't actually shutting it completely, and made it a point to make sure I heard the door latch, and would even pull on the doorknob to be sure it would not open. Yet sometime later, I'd go to get a towel and find it half open, all while it would just be me in the house. I'll finish this up with one of the most terrifying experiences I had just before we finally moved out. My husband was working a double shift at his job, and it was dark by the time I made it back home that evening. After getting home, I went to straightening up the house. As I was picking things up, I reached down and nearly grabbed a massive black spider. I recoiled in horror before realizing it was the fake plastic spider my nephew had been playing with earlier in the day. I was half relieved and half annoyed, as I was always on edge anytime I was alone in the house, and grabbed the creepy toy and flung it hard up the stairs. There was a bedroom up there, where I kept toys for my nephew when he visited. I planned to pick it up and pack it away in his toy box when I went up there to straighten the room up later. Side note, my nephew was terrified to sleep up there, and often would not play up there alone because of what he called spookies. As I turned away from the steps to go back to cleaning the downstairs, I heard a whooshing through the air, and then something slam against the wall at the bottom of the steps. I jumped to see what in the world that was, and felt my blood run ice cold. There that stupid toy spider laid on the floor at the bottom of the steps, as if someone or something had thrown it back down the stairs. I left that house. I left with my keys and phone and called my husband to tell him I was going to my parents' house until he got home. As previously mentioned, we moved shortly after this experience, and I was never alone in that house after dark again. That house has sat vacant since we left, still debating on selling or renting it out. My husband still insists it was his prankster grandmother. I still refer to it as the upstairs boogeyman. Several years ago, I was in my early 20s and ended up in a relationship that shouldn't have ever happened. It was a mess from the start, but that's a story for a different sub. What made it worse was the creepy house he lived in. The house itself was beautiful. It was a large older house with a beautiful staircase, 3 bathrooms, and 5 bedrooms. It had basically been gutted and rebuilt. I often wonder if that had a hand in all the weird phenomenon. While it looked beautiful, it didn't feel homey. It felt lonely and empty. Initially, I chalked this up to its size and need for more homey decor. Of course, there was the cliché feeling of being watched, which I'm no stranger to, especially at nighttime, when we would be watching TV with most of the lights off. A long hallway branched off from the living room, and I felt like someone was glaring at us from the dark corridor. All stuff you can shake off. My first real oh crap moment was one evening after I got off work. He texted to let me know he'd be working a bit later and to go ahead to the house and let myself in to freshen up. This house had an amazing bathroom with a jacuzzi tub on the lower level, so I jumped at the chance to get in and relax. After filling the tub up with nearly melt-your-skin-off hot water, I laid back with my eyes closed. This euphoric moment was interrupted when I heard the front door down the hall slam. I could hear what sounded like heavy boots shuffling around before they started stomping down the hallway. I heard every aggressive step until they stopped right outside the bathroom door. I knew he was home and must be in a bad mood and was ready for what could be a crappy evening. Several seconds passed, but he never entered or said anything. I also never heard him walk away. After a good minute or two, I called out his name with no response. I had talked to him about my feelings about the house, and he had admitted he felt the same and had had some freaky experiences since living there. I then realized he was trying to mess with me, and would probably bust through the door to scare me any minute. I called back out to him, letting him know not to bother, that it wouldn't work. It was met with eerie silence. I decided the whole relaxation thing was over and got out to confront him. I opened the bathroom door to absolutely no one there. I admit, I was shaking as I looked down the hallway to see if he was trying to hide, but again saw no one. As I went back into the bathroom to get my phone to call him, I heard the front door open again and could hear him setting stuff down. I come down the hall and he greeted me. He seemed to be in a good mood. He made a joke about knowing I'd be in the bath when he noticed my robe. I was practically speechless. He asked what was wrong, and I explained what had happened. He waved it off, saying he heard that stuff all the time. "You get used to it," he said simply. He was right. I heard this quite frequently, both when I was alone in the house, and we would both hear it together at times. Another time, we were sitting on the couch discussing what to get into for the day. It was bright and sunny outside. We were discussing maybe going hiking when all of a sudden the front door burst open with such force the door made contact with the wall behind it and bounced off of it. We both were stunned for several moments until I spoke up and said the wind must be bad outside. He remarked about how there was literally no wind outside, and we walked out onto the porch to a very still, pleasant day. Another evening, it was just getting dark out, and I was watching TV alone while he was in another room working on something. I never put much thought into orbs or took the whole orb thing seriously, to be honest, until that night. As I'm watching TV, I see what looks like a small circular ball of light come down from the staircase from the corner of my eye. I turned to look at it head on, and it floated below the TV and up the massive shelf to the right of the TV. I watched it float all the way up to the top, shelf by shelf, until reaching the ceiling and vanishing. I was covered in goosebumps, and I felt terrified. I knew there was nothing that could have caused that. All the windows were sealed off with the blinds closed as well as the heavy drapes. I also did not hear a single vehicle pass by at that time. The TV was also on a low volume. I ended up calling for him to come to living room. Again, I sputtered off like a terrified idiot. He seemed to actually be a bit freaked out by that himself, but said it didn't surprise him. Whatever it was, it liked being noticed. I'll leave off with one experience that I still get insanely weirded out by when I think about it to this day. We had both fallen asleep while watching TV one night. I remember it was in the middle of winter, and it was cold in the house, as keeping the large house heated in low temperatures was both hard and expensive. I was on one end of the couch and he was on the other. I woke up with a start and felt very disoriented. I then reached for my phone to see what time it was, only to feel even more panicked when I saw it was nearly 5 a.m. I had to work that morning in less than a couple of hours, and I did not bring my work clothes with me, as I did not plan on spending the night. I threw the blanket off of me to get up and grab my shoes and keys when I noticed my ex was wide awake, sitting up on the other side of the couch looking at me. I was taken aback as he had such a strange look on his face. I asked him what was wrong, and why didn't he wake me up sooner, as he knew my work situation. He just shook his head and slowly looked away. Odd, but I didn't have time to really get into it with him. I just needed to hurry and make the 30-minute drive home to get ready for work. As I got my shoes on and got my keys, he asked me to please not go yet until he was ready. I went to ask him what he was getting ready for, as I knew he was off that day, but he was gone down the hall to the bedroom before I could ask. He came back a couple of minutes later, fully dressed, and was putting his coat on. I then asked where in the world he was going. He told me he was going to his mother's house, which was just a few houses down from his own. I looked at him like he was crazy and told him it's 5 in the morning. Surely your mom is asleep. He told me it didn't matter. He had a key and would rest on the couch until she got up. Again, I was weirded out, but also pressed for time and mentally noted to ask him about this later. We walked outside, said goodbye, and he headed straight to his mom's. Later in the day, I had texted to ask him about it, but he said he'd rather explain in person. After I get off work, I head to his house and wasted no time asking what had gotten into him. He seemed reluctant to talk about it, but did start to tell the story. He said he had woke up a little before me. When he woke up, he too was disoriented at first, but quickly realized what had woke him up. He said it felt like someone was hitting the back of the couch. As he started to wake up more and realized that wasn't possible, he suddenly locked his eyes on me. I was still sound asleep when he said it was like something took over him. He felt himself start growling. His teeth were clenched together so tight that his jaw ached, but he couldn't control it. He said he could feel he was showing his teeth as his growls got deeper and louder. He explained that the growls were so animalistic that he could not imitate it. The whole time he could not look away from me, while he felt this strong feeling of anger come over him. He also said another part of him was wondering how I was not waking up, as his growling had become so loud that his ears were ringing. In reality, he said it probably only lasted 15 or 20 seconds, but to him it felt like it was much longer. Just as suddenly as it started, he snapped out of it. As the growling stopped, he He was able to relax his jaw and look away from me. He said he sat there for several minutes while I never once even moved. He said he couldn't decide whether he should wake me up or not. He was so confused. When I did wake up and went to leave, he was so shaken by the whole experience, he was scared to be alone in the house. Hence him asking me to stay so he could get ready to go to his mom's until daybreak at least. Other things happened, but that last one always got me. Did whatever that thing was want to hurt me. Want him to hurt me. I was honestly relieved knowing I'd never have to go back there once we split for good. He's moved since, and I wonder what the new inhabitants have experienced. By the end of the spring semester of our senior year, the state of mind for me and my friends could be described simply as burned out. The semester was hard on all of us, and we desperately needed a reset for our brains. I've never been one to make plans, and this time around was no different. I knew that if I waited long enough, Steven or Josh would make plans for us. "You guys are going to love this idea," Steven said with way too much enthusiasm as he walked into our dorm. "Here we go," Brian said, rolling his eyes as he looked over at me. Steven and Josh were always the ones to make plans for us. While Josh's ideas were always simpler, stuff like bowling or bar hopping, Steven's plans were always a bit more out of the box for our group. "Camping excursion," Steven exclaimed. "What?" Josh called out from his room. "We have all admitted that this semester has beat our asses, right? That we all needed something new to jumpstart our brains and get us ready to take on our final semester? Well, I think this is it." I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. God, I haven't been camping since I was like 8. I think you were with me that time, right, Brian? "Yeah, that would have been my last time too," Brian replied. And Steven continued, "After school ends, who knows if we still have a chance to do it again." Brian emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes. "You want to go camping in the summer when it stips hot out? That sounds like hell." "Oh, please. It's not even that bad when you get out there and get used to it," Steven sneered back. "Besides, it would just be like 2 days. We would hike off trail into the woods, set up camp, live a little, drink a lot, and then come back. Plus, if you really can't handle it and want to puss out, we can always come back earlier than planned." "Where would we even go?" I asked. "The Pine Barrens," Steven said, opening his hands in a ta-da motion. "The Pine Barrens?" Brian chuckled. "I thought you said you wanted to camp off trail in the woods? Isn't stat camping like that not allowed there?" "Yes," Steven retorted. "But I have a buddy that recently got a job out there. He says that the rangers don't even go off the trails to look for people camping out there, and even if they do find campers, they just tell them politely to leave, and then go on. I'm up for some camping. I think it sounds like a fun idea," Brian said. "Well, I think if we do, it'll end up a total shit show," Josh said as he downed a whole glass of water. "Michael," Steven said, looking at me. "Looks like it's Sips your call." Josh wasn't happy with my answer, but I have always been a very go-with-the-flow type of person, and if Brian thought it would be fun, then I was going to trust him. Brian had been my best friend since childhood. The number of stories he and I could tell of our misadventures together would be extensive. At the end of the day, I would always side with him if he thought it was a good idea. A few weeks later, we had the trip planned out and were on our way to the Pine Barrens. Living in the Philadelphia area meant that the journey to the Barrens wasn't difficult at all, only taking about a 2-hour drive to reach the place where Brian parked his SUV on the side of a dirt road for us to begin carrying our supplies into the woods. I was worried that the forest was going to be difficult to walk through, but under the canopy of pines, the forest floor was clear and easy to navigate, only having to walk through the occasional knee-high shrubs. Despite most of us not being nature people, hiking through the woods was surprisingly enjoyable. The Pine Barrens itself were beautiful, and the sounds and smells gave a surprisingly comforting feeling. We enjoyed joking around on the hike, seeing sights and laughing at Josh after he got stuck in knee-deep sludge when we tried walking through what Steven described as a depressional bog, basically just a low wet spot in the forest. After we reached a clear open spot about a mile into the woods, we began setting up our tents. The camp setup went by fairly quickly and without a hitch. We had a large tent where the 4 of us could all fit comfortably. We found some rocks and made a fire pit, and were soon all a few beers deep and trying to figure out how to grill the burgers we brought in the cooler without a grill. Despite the forest's beauty and my time being well enjoyed, I couldn't help but notice the forest was getting quieter, not silent. Just like the birds and bugs were farther away, this realization was accompanied by a strange feeling. I looked to the forest floor around us, but saw nothing there. I assumed this weird feeling came from the alcohol, mixing with the feeling of being in an unfamiliar place, and the quietness of the forest being caused by 4 loud college guys, scaring all the wildlife away. I did my best to just ignore it and have fun. As the evening fell to nighttime, and all of us had more drinks than necessary, we gathered around the fire and reminisced about the past few years, and talked about what was to come in our future. Steven scheduled our trip around something called a supermoon. Apparently, the moon was supposed to be bigger and brighter that night. I didn't really pay much attention to it, but I suppose it was a bit brighter. The full moon above us lit the forest in a gentle blue glow before being drowned in darkness as clouds covered the sky, only for the light to re-emerge minutes later. "I'm telling you, Samantha is 100% into you," I said laughing, as I watched Steven's face get red for a reason, other than the alcohol. "I know that, but things are complicated," Steven said, hanging his head. "If you know that's then, what the hell are you doing here in the middle of the woods?" Josh asked, tossing a small twig at him. "'Cause you guys are my friends." Steven leaned back in his chair. "Besides, I'll be out of college soon. Me and Samantha are going to have different paths. It wouldn't work. I wanted to have just one weekend where we could hang out without having to worry about any responsibility or bullshit. Experience something new, have some good laughs, love a little before all this ends." "You start talking like we start never going to hang out after college," I said, chuckling as I sat up. "We start still going to be friends, dude." "Yeah," Josh added. "What? Are you planning on disappearing after all this is done?" "No," Steven said. "I just know we still all have very different lives once we graduate. You guys are the closest friends I've had. I just don't first want that to end." "Don't be dumb," Josh said, as he chucked a crushed beer can into the darkness. "We aren't going to stop being friends because we get some stupid piece of paper." Brian stood up and patted Steven on the shoulder. "I'd say something nice too, but we both know I don't have the emotional intelligence for that. But we aren't going anywhere. It's getting late though. I'm gonna go take a piss and get some sleep." "That's probably a good idea," Steven added, chuckling. "We shall explore the area around the camp tomorrow if you guys feel up for it. I think I saw on the map that there was a creek nearby." As I climbed into the tent behind the rest of the group, I took one last glance back into the woods. I noticed the silence again, at this point. However, this time it was worse. I could barely make out the sound of bugs in the distance. The immediate forest around us felt dead. Hollow. As I slowly zipped up the tent, I was struck with a sudden wave of discomfort, as though I had done something wrong and knew I would be caught. I turned to Brian. I could see that he was feeling the same thing. We talked for a moment about what it could be. Josh made sure to lay on the jokes about how we were scared that Bigfoot was going to come get us. I could have sworn, though, that Josh had the same nervous look in his eyes. Eventually, we settled on the paranoia being caused by the drinks. We joked around a bit more in the tent. After a while, we all swallowed the feeling, and I soon found myself dozing off. When Brian shook me awake, my head stirred as the effects of the alcohol in my system were now waning. I rolled over and grumbled, trying to get Brian to leave me alone. A few moments later, I felt another shake on my back. "What are you?" A hand quickly came over my mouth before I could finish my sentence. My eyes shot open, and I sat up, surprised by the sudden invasion of my personal space. I looked around the tent in a daze. I couldn't tell what time it was, but given the darkness from outside the tent, I could tell it had been long enough for the fire to have gone out. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I looked over to see Brian with his finger pressed tightly over his lips with a terrified expression on his face. Steven and Josh were awake as well. Steven shared Brian's expression, but Josh looked as confused and tired as me. I tilted my head in confusion and watched as he mouthed words to me. "There's something outside the tent." I sat still for a moment and closed my eyes. Through the quiet of the forest, I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I could hear whatever it was pacing around the tent slowly. I could make out 4 distinct footfalls. "Before I woke you, it was closer to our tent." Brain leaned in and whispered, "I could hear it breathing right next to you. It didn't sound right." "Maybe it is just some animal?" I whispered back. As Brian went to respond, he suddenly froze and put his finger to his ear in a listen motion. As the noise reached my ears, a cold chill ran down my spine. I can only describe the sound as a labored breathing, the thing sounding like a hospice patient on their last day. Steven looked petrified by the sound, but Josh looked angry. "Hey, get the hell out of here," Josh yelled out, slapping the side of the tent, his booming voice disturbing what felt like a sacred silence. The breathing and walking stopped. I looked over to Brian to see him covering his lips again with his finger. I shook my head at Josh in protest, but he continued. "Its steps, just some animal. If we scepter loud enough, its steps scare." Before he could finish, an ear-piercing scream ripped through the air. It sounded like a person in agonizing pain mixed with the sound of metal being cut with an angle grinder. It was so loud that my ears rang like I was right next to a gunshot. The silence that followed the scream only lasted a few seconds, but the tension it left was something you could feel through your whole body. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the tent poles snapping as it collapsed on top of us. The tent quickly became a jumbled mess of thrashing limbs and screams as we tried to find a way out of the tent. The sounds of panic were accompanied by another sound, a hard, heavy, and continuous pounding on the ground. With every few hits, I could hear a strange, wet cracking sound. Without warning, the pounding stopped and was replaced by more of the demented screams of the thing outside the tent. I covered my ears to shield myself from the thing's cries. As I removed my hands, I heard the worst thing I could imagine at that moment, the sound of tent canvas slowly tearing. I thrashed around crying for help, looking for an escape as I could feel the tent begin to lift up as the thing was trying to now get inside the tent with us. I felt the cool night air hit my hand as I stuck it out. What would have been the door of the tents. I felt someone grab my hand and wrench me from the tents. I was on my feet now. In the darkness, I could see Brian pulling me with Steven already at the wood line. Through the adrenaline, I could hear Brian screaming, "Run, Michael! Run! Get to the car!" As I reached the wood line about 40 feet away, I turned back for a brief moment. In the light of the moon, I could make out the shapes of what was happening. The front half of the thing was in the tent. It was thrashing around inside, pulling and tearing at something. Its back legs resemble a small horse, but it appeared as if it had no fur, revealing what looked like large tight muscle under its dark skin. It had a long, slender tail, and two massive protrusions that came out of the center of its back. Without warning, the creature lurched back, standing on its hind legs with the tent still covering its head and screaming its awful screech into the forest. It was tall, at least 7 feet from where I could see its head was in the tent. It stretched out its protrusions, and what I could now see were massive leathery wings. At that moment, I turned and followed my friends in the direction we came. I ran through the darkness, only able to see from the light of the moon that periodically would be covered in clouds and drowned the forest in a thick darkness. We slammed into trees and tripped over roots in the shadows of the clouds. After what felt like an eternity of running, we found ourselves running downhill, and our feet landed on soft, moist ground. We had reached the bog from earlier. We were only halfway to the car. Steven stopped running and fell to the ground. In the moonlight, I could see blood on his side and leg. "Steven, are you all right, man?" I asked, kneeling down beside him. "It didn't touch me. It's not mine." Steven replied quietly. I looked around. The forest was alive again. I could hear bugs buzzing around us and making their cries. It was then that I noticed something missing. "Where's Sep's Josh?" Brian sat against a tree with his head in his hands. "Brian, where the hell's Josh?" I said louder. "It killed him," Steven said through clenched teeth. "What?" I said, feeling my stomach drop. The thing was punching holes straight through him. It was like it knew right where he was laying. I swear. I watched it punch a hoof into his chest. "What the hell kind of animal was that?" Brian said, looking up at us with tear-stained eyes. "Maybe it's a deer with that rotting sickness crap." Steven said, sitting up. "I don't think so. What kind of animal like that has wings?" I said in a shaky voice. "Wings?" Steven said. "There, Stips, no animals like that has wings." We stared at each other for a moment, with confused and scared looks before a familiar horrifying scream tore through the forest behind us. The three of us shot to our feet. "No, please God, no." Steven began to cry. "Come on, "We have to go. We have to get to the car." Brian began backing up quickly before turning to run. The two of us followed Brian through the darkness as another scream rang out. It was much closer now. It had to have been at the top of the depression looking down on us. I heard what sounded like a crash behind me. In fear, I ran faster before being stopped in my tracks as I heard Steven's cry. "Michael, stop! Help me, please." I turned back to see Steven on his chest, sunk into his knees in sludge from a wetter part of the bog. "Please don't leave me, Michael. Please," Steven said with panicked, sharp breaths as he tried pulling himself from the sludge. I took a step forward before seeing a dark figure creeping down the slope of the bog on all fours. For a moment I was paralyzed in fear, and my brain gave me a single command in the form of a thought: run. As I turned and ran, Steven's cries and pleading for help pierced my soul. Steven had been a friend of mine for years. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't. I just kept running. Even as he pleads turned to agonizing screams. Even as I heard the sounds of bones cracking and flesh tearing, I didn't turn back. I left my friend to die in that bog. I left him for the devil to claim. I caught up to Brian and we ran together, refusing to speak, plagued by Steven's screams slowly fading as we went farther away. We kept running through the darkness. Even as we both realized that we should have reached the car by that point, we kept running. The clouds grew denser overhead, and soon the two of us were sprinting through pure darkness. Brian must have seen it before I did. He stopped dead in his tracks and called out as I sprinted by him. "Michael, stop. Look." His voice went silent as my shins slammed into something hard, sending me crashing down on what I could feel was a concrete floor. I curled into a ball and groaned in pain. Looking up, I could see that we had stumbled into a large concrete structure. All around us were graffiti-painted walls and what looked like the bottom of concrete pylons sticking out of the ground. "What the hell is this?" I groaned quietly. "The frame of some old abandoned building," Brian said through strained panting. "I heard the Pine Barrens are full of them, but I didn't think we were close enough to run to one though." "We thought you're dead," I muttered as I sat up and put my back against a nearby pylon. "We have no clue where we are. We don't know where the car is. It killed them. It's going to kill us." Brian sat down beside me and put his arm around me in an attempt to calm me. "We start going to be okay. Look at the graffiti around us. This place has to be popular. There has to be a road nearby. We still find it and get out of here." For a brief moment, Brian instilled a glimmer of hope in me. Hope that this nightmare was nearly over. Hope that we were safe. But that hope was short-lived, for in the brief moment of hope was when we noticed it. The woods around us, they were silent. My heart sank as I could hear a faint noise in the distance. The sound of branches breaking and shifting, accompanied by a whooshing sound through the trees, like a wind that would stop, and start again. A wind that was getting closer. Brian grabbed my arm and pulled me to a dark corner where two of the tall concrete walls met, shadowing that area in darkness. I could feel the wind that the creature's wings were pushing down on me. I looked up to see the monster's silhouette painted against the night sky. The thing's proportions were unnatural. Its neck looked too long for its body. Its head was too large, looking almost like a horse's head on a deer's body. I heard the monster's hooves clack on the concrete as it landed on the wall above us. The devil let out its horrible scream as a large cloud covered the moon, leaving us with only the sounds of our surroundings. For a moment, I nearly brought my hands up to shield my ears from its monstrous cry, but I restrained myself in fear that it would see our movements in the darkness. I didn't know if the beast had already seen us, but the idea that it hadn't was the only thing that I could cling to in that moment. For a few seconds, we sat in silence, refusing to move, to tremble, to breath, believing the thing of nightmares above us hadn't seen us and would move on. But we were wrong. My heart sank as I felt a liquid dripping down on my head and neck, followed by sharp inhales inches from our heads. The thing knew we were there the whole time. There was nothing we could have done. I began hyperventilating as I heard what sounded like a wet mouth opening, and I felt what I can only describe as a wet, warted tongue drag across my face. The monster's mouth reeked of rot and disease. I heard its wheezing breath go farther from my ear as the devil's head moved away from me. I can only assume it was doing the same to Brian as I began to hear him quietly sob next to me. We both knew the situation we were in. We were paralyzed in fear, unable to fight the living demon in front of us. The monster was deciding who it wanted first, and we were powerless to stop it. I heard the creature jump down off the wall and land in front of us. Despite the blackness, I could see the shape of the devil creeping towards us. It was so close, I could feel its body heat radiate off of it. I began to cry with Brian. I'm ashamed to admit the feeling I had in that moment. In such primal, fearful moments, your brain will give you feelings and thoughts that will make you sick. Brian has been by my side since childhood. He was the closest thing I've had in my life to a brother. I loved him. But at that moment, I prayed that the devil would take him instead of me. A feeling that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The clouds pulled back, and the curtain of darkness with it. I could see the devil's face now, a form more hideous than I could have imagined. A gnarled, rotting human face pulled over the skull of a horse, ram horns protruding and twisting out of its demonic dark gray visage. In the bright moonlight, the devil's eyes shone a dull, glossy red. The demon had a large scar carving a canyon across the right side of the monster's face, revealing overhanging, jagged teeth and jaw muscles. The mere existence of the creature looked agonizing. Its mouth dripped with the blood of Stephen and Josh. I shut my eyes and covered my ears as the creature screamed in our face. I clenched my fists, expecting to feel myself ripped open at any moment to become the monster's next piece of food or entertainment. I listened in horror as I heard Brian's cries turn to a pained scream, accompanied by a visceral crunching sound. A wind stirred up around me as I heard his cries for help being carried off to trees just out of sight. I sat still in shock, the horror of it all forbidding me from moving, from running. I listened to Brian scream for at least an hour. I waited for his screams to stop and for the devil to come and take me next, but he never did. I heard Brian's cries disappear. The devil screamed one last time, and then it was gone. But still, I waited in terror. I couldn't muster the willpower to stand until the light of dawn shone through the trees a few hours later. I shambled through the woods like a zombie, covered in dirt and cuts. I hadn't walked 200 yards before I stepped out onto a large, paved road. I walked down the road expecting it all to be a sick trick. I expected that, at any moment, the devil would swoop down and take me, that there would be nothing I could do to stop it, that the monster enjoyed giving me hope just to take it away at the last second. I remember falling on the road and screaming as I saw a police car approaching in the distance. I remember the confused and horrified look he had as he got out of his car. I told them everything, but of course it wasn't good enough. 3 missing persons needs a better explanation than the description of some old folklore creature. No trace of my friends were ever found. No blood, no campsite, nothing. They tried catching their scent with dogs, but the dogs would always stop before going too deep into the woods. Besides Brian's SUV, it was as if we were never in those woods at all. At first, I was a suspect. Then the official story became 4 college students had a bad trip on some substance and got lost and separated in the Pine Barrens with only one surviving. When I refused to retract the story of what really happened, I was put in a psych ward for a few months. I wasn't let out until I lied and said it was all a figment of my imagination. I have nothing left now. My friends are dead. My family thinks I'm either a junkie or a murderer. The police refuse to help me, and my mental state has completely fallen apart since then. I can't step outside without being plagued by the feeling that I had when I stepped out on that road. I can't sleep without being tormented by the images of that night. I can't bring myself to connect with anyone in fear that it will take them too. I shouldn't have survived that night. I wish now that I hadn't survived, but I did. It let me survive. The devil let me live. And after all this time, I finally think I understand why. It wants people to know what happened, the real story of how my friends died. Maybe it wants to keep people out, or maybe it wants to entice people in. I don't know anymore. I'm hoping that in writing this and sharing the truth, it'll get the right message across. If you are reading this, the devil is real. Stay out of the Pine Barrens. I couldn't comprehend the thought of sharing this with all who read this, but here I am, fired from my job years ago. I guess it is time that I share this with you all. You will not hear this throughout the news, nor on any sites other than this, because it was kept hidden by the United States Geological Survey, or USGS. I guess they feared that their reputation would be tarnished by such outlandish claims I will be telling. I should start with this question. Are gods real? Back in June of 2018, when Kilauea was erupting in Leilani, I was one of those who was monitoring the activity of the caldera as magma drained like a pool towards the fissures. Back then, I believed in the rational and simplistic, as hard it is to believe for most, once they learn the complexity of volcanoes. As I studied for this volcano for a very long time, things become simpler the more you get to know it. Kilauea holds vast old lava flows, telling the archaic story of the volcano, like how Hawaiians passed on their knowledge by telling stories and myths about gods causing natural disasters through simple family rivalry. It's up to us geologists to interpret the layers of lava like pages in a book so we can see what it could do in the future. At that time, this was business as usual for the volcano, writing another page to its book at the price of wasting its own ink. I was there, paying close attention to its caldera formation until I got a call to the south of the caldera. The superiors said a crack opened up at the Koe fault system, perhaps as a response to the ever-so-sinking yet quaking caldera, and it was deep, very deep. They had said that we needed to get there quickly as it was during that period of time when the caldera stopped sinking. I remembered the cool breeze coming from the southwest as I got out of my vehicle. From what I could remember, it was only a few feet wide, yet extended for many hundreds of feet and seemed to go down into the inky black. They were thinking of getting a group down there, see what was down there, and see what history could unfold amongst the jagged walls of rock. They have sent robots down there to scout it out, none of which returned for reasons even they don't know about. They turned to the next best thing, us. They figured we had enough experience to go down there, and that we know of a few hazards down there. We only have limited time, about a few hours from what I remembered, to get samples, investigate the fault, and get out. I was excited and curious about what we could discover and fill in the blanks, but I was also concerned about the risks down here, like shifting faults and falling rocks. For that reason, they hired Jim and Sam, adventurous cavers, to keep us safe while advising us on whatever danger lays down here, and a few geologists, including me, for this careful excursion. I regretted when I looked back, how things could have been, and spared me of its secrets we should not have recovered. Sam was first to go down, as she was the most experienced. Later was Alana, one of the geologists who made an offering of wena berries to the goddess, to Tumpile for a safe journey down. It was me who was next, and as I was going down that tight hole, there was a shock through the ground like a bomb exploded in the distance. It was an earthquake, a weak one at that, and didn't cause any worry at the time, except for me. I was worried the sharp rocks may close on me if the next shock happened, but Harry, the next one after me, reassured it'll be safe, enforcing my curiosity for the deep below. Jim came after, signaling our expedition into the dark, as he joked about being cave creatures down there. Sam and Alana had discussions about safety, while I and Harry were conversing about what Kilauea might have done in its fiery youth. According to our theories, Kilauea was formed by the Hawaiian hotspot about 250,000 years ago, growing until it breached the surface 100,000 years ago. Yet we only knew 15,000 years of its history, as 90% of its surface is covered in lava, only less than 1,000 years old. Harry disagreed with that birth date of Kilauea, and suggested it was much older, about 500,000 years ago, based on a few lava samples dredged up from its underwater flanks. Either way, all there should be expected were a few rock samples that fill in said gaps in Kilauea's fragmentary history. How foolish I was to expect this back then. As we climbed down, with the rope secured tightly, we turned our flashlights upon our helmets to see the various shades of dimmest reds, darkest grays, and lightest blacks of the layers as we passed by, the dust settling upon our gloved hands as we passed by. Harry was taking samples of pictures, and I was taking samples of rock into bottles and bags, so we could test them later. Sam was paving the safe way for us to go as the earth jolted a few times a minute. Alana was documenting via video for the sake of documenting our journey, whilst Jim made sure the line was secured above us. The first odd thing I noticed was when we were about half a mile deep, and it was subtle at first. When we were climbing down, it became more and more open. What were a few feet became a massive cavern enough to fit a commercial airplane in. I was looking around with my helmet light on, and saw a few pockets of lava that sparkled in the light like stars in the night sky in front of me. The only lava I know of that could sparkle like that was obsidian, more commonly associated with lavas more massive and sicky than the swift and fluid basalt Kilauea is made of. Upon touching this material, however, rather than feeling smooth, it was sandy yet densely metallic like magnetic sand in science museums. Harry explained it might be ash, as ash is made of tiny fragmented glass anyways, and could, under certain circumstances, shine like that. I internally doubted this, as I have seen Kalaua's ash and it is nothing like this, but I digressed. For all I knew, Kalaua's might have erupted a different ash in the past, an ash we had not seen before. After we passed that, going further down, we could feel heat coming from below. We weren't surprised, as we were in one of the most active volcanoes on the planet. What we weren't expecting was solid, pink granite, a full mile down, half embedded within the cake display of the contrasting crumbling rock. Even stranger was it seemed to be cut by into a prismatically cut pillar. Alana was extensively documenting like a crazed vlogger, while Harry's jaw was precariously agape. I was struggling to find an explanation for this, and from what I knew, the volcanism of Hawaii could not form granite, let alone make it a perfectly cut 10-foot wide pillar. It had to be transported from somewhere. Only Hawaiian habitation was dated to be from 900 AD, and didn't have the technology to make this. Bet it was the aliens. I remember Jim suggesting so nonchalantly as the rest of us groaned in frustration. It might as well be aliens, as this was the only explanation left at the time to explain this. This was groundbreaking, at least for all of us down here. Not only will it rewrite the history of the volcano, but the history of life on Earth as well. Harry measured it to be about 200 feet tall before we hit flat ground. The ground was not what we were expecting from a volcanic place. What we were expecting was rugged yet fragile lava, not flat, cemented ground we stood finally on. It was so warm we had to put on extra measures in case we got heat stroke, an irony in this dark, deep place. I remembered the repulsive smell of sulfur down here was so overpowering we put on gas masks to make it better. We shone our flashlights, only to realize it was the misty volcanic gases dampening our light, causing our view of vision to only be a few feet away. This was typical again for the volcano, minus the pillar. We looked around until Alana called out to us about 50 feet away in the hot mist-like gas. We went to her and saw that there was another granite pillar, like the one earlier. Another 50 feet, another one, and so on, until the fifth pillar, and we realized something isn't right. A shock rocked the inexplicable place we were in, reminding us about the power Kilauea has in spite of the weirdness. I was thinking that this whole structure wasn't supposed to be here, and questions spurred into my mind. Who built this? How did it get down here? Why is it here? Many sorts of those questions racing through my mind. Running out of time, Harry tried to call out to Sam, only to get silence amongst the rumbling of the beast. We all called for her to no avail, so by nature we split up to find her. I and Alana went forwards, while Jim and Harry went back, scanning for her presence. Going forward, we talked about where Sam could be. Alana suggested that she could be lost while scouting the area, while I was more concerned about going back up before the area becomes our tomb. Alana and I argued, setting out my concerns while Alana said hers until we both agreed to seek out Sam and confirm her fate within an hour. We were running out of time until we saw something, a faint orange glow in the dark, piercing through the gas like a lighthouse in a storm. We thought it was Sam's light, perhaps in relief to see us, until we heard swift yet nearly silent footsteps coming towards us. By the time we ever noticed, it was a fleeting moment when something quickly knocked Alana so hard she flew towards the pillars with a loud thud. I tried to run in the direction she was thrown, but blocked by a tall yet thin figure. All that I remembered of this horrid face, a face of nothing but wrinkled, solid lava and two glowing eyes, stood a few feet above me and made me feel small as sweat poured down my face. The eyes themselves were the worst part. Orange yet piercing, like the lava vents I saw at Poshov. I felt this overwhelming dread as it looked at me, inhumanly, frozen in place and heart pounding faster than ever, anticipating its next move. Before I could ever think to prepare my fate, before it sprinted away in an uncannily quick motion without a sound, disappearing into the gas. I ran away, searching for the rope as rocks fell upon the floor with each quake. That is when I saw the rope and got out. I couldn't bear to see this thing come at me, and looking back I could have stayed for their sakes. Call me a coward, a narcissist if you will, but those dreaded eyes are enough to convince me they won't last long. Someone had to carry this burden to tell this. As I quickly climbed up the rope, I could only hear the gurgling and hissing in the depths below. and a light that shone from below that I presumed to be the hot lava flooding the floor. It only became hotter as I remembered tears rolling down my face and evaporating, clouding my vision as it precipitated the glass so much I took the mask off. The walls began to close in as I climbed and climbed, the air cooler and fresher. At some point I became stuck and began to panic after every method failed, causing me to yell for help for hours until I sounded like a whimpering dog. I had this feeling of despair come in, seeing the light of what must have been the full moon as my throat itches for water, my skin covered in bruises and scratches like battle scars. I wondered if this is the end, if I am joining my group in some other place, or if I should go to hell for leaving them like this. I heard the voices of them, telling me that I should not let them to die, and I should be ashamed for it. Sometimes I looked down and sworn I could have seen a pair of orange eyes stare back in the darkness as rocks tumbled down with each shock, making my body feel tighter than ever. As the sun rose, I felt weaker and more willing to just die here, my heart slowing down and the black getting closer. I then heard a voice from above, different from the rest. It was a rescuer, trying to save me as the walls became tighter. It took many hours for them to chip at the rock before they freed me, getting me up to the surface. I scarfed down as much water as I could and tried to tell them about the thing down there, like a frantic maniac descending into madness, only to meet with rationalizations in their false reality. They thought I killed them, but my unstable state was what made them think it wasn't, the only part where they believed me. I was checked in for a delusion I knew wasn't. That was when I was let go from the USGS, understandably, because I was becoming as unstable as the volcano itself, getting nightmares about the thing in the depths, paranoid they'll reach the surface and cause havoc upon our world. Once the eruption ended, this mostly stopped, and months went by before it became clearer, although it only made my obsession grow. I knew it was real. They had to, even after all these years, had to know what happened down there. They covered it up, and only let their families know of the deaths they made up, leaving me the only one who knew their true cause of their demise that even I am not sure of. Poor Alana was the only one I knew was dead, where the others I presumed to be engulfed by the lava or killed by the thing that guards the deep, like the Minotaur. Even if they were somehow safe, they are dead now. Ever since the volcano's last few eruptions, I looked onto live streams on YouTube, and all I could see is that dreaded face everywhere the lava spills from the cracks, and it takes me back to that day, the day I realized gods are real. I have suffered with sleep paralysis since I was a child. Throughout all my years of dealing with this, I have had some truly horrific experiences. However, the one I had a couple of days ago has been the worst one yet. I woke up not feeling the greatest. I was up a few hours, and after not feeling much better, I decided to lay back down and try to nap it off. I was turned on my side, facing away from our bedroom door, on the far side of mine and my husband's king-size bed. I felt my body relax, and I fell asleep rather quickly. Next thing I remember is slowly opening my eyes and seeing our bedroom wall and the door that leads to our bathroom as the bathroom door was closed. I then tried to move and couldn't. As I'd been through this many times, I was already mentally telling myself I was in sleep paralysis and I needed to focus on trying to move a little, such as wiggling my fingers, a tip I learned online. However, I'm already feeling scared and I can feel my heart racing. I then hear the sound of our bedroom door open and close behind me as our bedroom door makes a very loud and distinct popping noise. I immediately thought it was my husband coming in to check on me and thought he'd be able to get me to snap out of this horror. That thought quickly vanished as I heard heavy stomping running around the bed until they stopped directly in front of me, and I see a very large and tall black figure standing in front of our bathroom door. This is the same figure I encounter in almost all of my sleep paralysis experiences. I can never make out any features. Before I can register any other thoughts, the large figure lunges at me. I feel the heavy weight of this thing on my body, and it feels like it's crushing me, especially in my ribs. By now I've closed my eyes and I'm trying so desperately to move. That's when I felt teeth burying into my ribs. I don't know how to truly describe the awful feeling. It's an intense feeling of pressure, pain, and almost a tickling sensation, and it's one of the worst things I've ever felt. As previously mentioned, I'm still laid on my side with both my arms pulled up and my hands are tucked under my pillow. At this point, I'm trying to thrash away and trying to scream, but I'm still completely paralyzed. and I feel like I have no air left in me, and I never am able to make a sound. At this point, I'm mentally screaming and pleading to snap out of it. I can literally feel this thing's mouth opening and closing in different spots along the side of my ribs. Next thing I know, I sit straight up in the bed. My heart is racing. I'm broke out in a cold sweat, and I can still feel tingles in my ribs on my left side. After my eyes dart around the room, and I find it to be completely empty, I lift up my shirt to inspect my side. The skin is not broken, but the whole left side of my ribcage is bright red. I've done a good amount of research on sleep paralysis, and I understand the scientific explanation for it, but waking up with physical marks from these experiences is brand new to me. I have had a ton of anxiety when it's bedtime ever since. This experience, I have truly come to understand no sleep. I was born in the early 90s. My parents were married in 1991, and I was born in 1992. For the first bit of my parents' marriage, they lived in a tiny apartment that needed a lot of work. When my mom found out she was pregnant with me, finding a better home with more space moved to the top of their to-do list. My mom was about 7 months along with me, and every house they had looked at had fallen through, until one. The one. It was located out in the middle of nowhere in our little town. But that's exactly what my parents wanted. It was a 2, could be 3 bedroom and 1 bath house. It had 2 enclosed porches, a massive kitchen sliding area and living room. The best part was the rent was just barely over the amount my parents were paying monthly for this tiny rundown apartment. While this wasn't a beachside luxury mansion, it was everything my parents wanted and then some. Of course, they jumped on this offer. It did not take long after moving in for the weirdness to start. Activity made itself known pretty much from day one. This experience in particular, I can remember even though I was only about 3 or 4 years old. Halloween has always been a major holiday for my family. My parents decided to host their first annual Halloween party in this house. It was a huge success. Tons of family and friends attended. They had music, food, games, costume contests. I remember I was Baby Bop from Barney, and the best part, a fake haunted house in the garage that sat apart from the house. After it was over, my mom's 2 sisters and her middle sister's boyfriend decided to sleep over instead of making the hour-long drive back home so late. My parents made the living room floor, which was in between my parents' room and what was considered my room, as cozy as they could. About 2 a.m., we said our goodnights, and I followed my parents into their room to crash, as I was absolutely terrified of my room. I remember waking up to the sound of someone knocking on my parents' closed bedroom door. My dad was dead to the world, so my mom got up to answer it. I heard the frantic voice of my older aunt asking where my dad was. My mom opened the bedroom door more so she could see my dad completely knocked out in the bed. My aunt's voice became even more pleading, as she asked if they could all move into their room and sleep in the floor. My mom agreed, as my aunt swore she would explain in the morning. I remember how excited I was to see my aunts and future uncle move their bedding in the small bedroom to sleep. It was my first sleepover in my young mind. Come morning, or later in the morning, I should say, we would find out what exactly had happened. My aunt said, after everyone had went to bed, and the lights were out, they started hearing movement coming from my room. At first it sounded like footsteps walking around the room. Then it started sounding like someone was moving stuff around. It got louder, like someone was digging through my toy box. Both my aunts and my future uncle were on alert, listening to this when creepy music started playing. They realized it was the music my dollhouse would play only when you pushed a special button. They were convinced my dad was behind this, as he is notorious for playing pranks on people. That's when my aunt ran and knocked on my parents' bedroom door to see if it was somehow his doing. When my mom showed her, he was sound asleep. She said it felt like her heart stopped as she could still hear movement coming from my room on the other side of the living room. After this, the experiences in the house got worse, and it was a very long time before my aunts and uncle would even visit again. Just days after this, my parents said I came running to them late one evening, and I was completely inconsolable. I said in between sobs that there was a mean face glaring at me through the living room window. This window being in the same area my family had ran from. These are just a few experiences from that wicked house. I have plenty more I'd love to share in the future. When my girlfriend Ella, recommended we go to the local Renaissance fair. I absolutely jumped on the idea. I hadn't been since I was a kid, but I always remembered loving it. The cool vendors, the food, the awesome jousting matches. It was everything a kid could love. My recent hyperfixation on medieval times and fantasy also definitely helped to drive my excitement for the event. I also had been needing a good excuse to get out and be social again. I had found myself too busy with school and work to get out and actually live. Both of us called up a bunch of our friends and worked out a time for us to meet up there and enjoy the festivities. We even both ordered and threw together simple medieval costumes to wear to the events. I was so excited for the day that would lead to such torment. The day itself was very eventful, enjoyable even. The Ren Fair was everything I hoped it would be, and more. Everyone had a great time watching the shows, shopping, eating overpriced food, and playing games. I remember loving getting to have Ella holding my arm by my side the whole time. We had been together for some time now. She had become such a fixture in my life that I couldn't imagine a world without her. While my time at the fair was spectacular, I had this weird feeling from the moment I walked through the gate that I was being watched. After the first few minutes, I blew off the feeling, thinking it was ridiculous. I assumed I hadn't been getting out enough. I had been too focused on my course's assignments and work, and had pushed off being social. I figured the feeling was just a bit of social anxiety after being cooped up too long. I chose to ignore it, and after a while the feeling waned to near nothingness. After the sun went down, and the group was getting ready to leave, that was when I first saw her, a woman, probably in her mid-30s. I couldn't explain why my eyes were drawn to her. She wasn't dressed up or anything. She was in normal, everyday street clothes. She was scanning the crowd intensely. Her expression was fixed with intensity. She looked over the crowd how I would expect a mother to look over a crowd after realizing she lost her child. Her eyes met mine as she combed over the crowd, and immediately the uneasy feeling at the start of the day came back worse than before. This time, though, there was something more. A mix of dread and sadness crept into my mind as our eyes locked. The woman's eyes widened with a more desperate look than before. I can't explain it, but I felt hypnotized by the look she gave me until one of my friends spoke up. "So are we getting out of here, or what?" I looked away from the woman to my friend, who must have seen the uncomfortable look on my face. "Whoa, Mason, you alright?" he asked. I looked back to the crowd, but the woman was gone, and with her disappearance the uneasy feeling faded as well. "Yeah. Sorry. Some lady was just staring at me really weird," I said with a chuckle that tried masking discomfort. "Yeah, let's get out of here." We all said our goodbyes in the parking area and went our separate ways. As Ella and I were making our way back to our truck, I heard a woman's voice approaching from behind us. "Excuse me, sir? Sir?" I turned around in time to see the woman from before approaching. It was darker in the parking area, but she was close enough that I could see what looked to be black beads in her hands. "Yeah? How can I help you?" I asked. "For you?" She smiled, but her voice was monotone. The woman held out the black beads that I could now see made a necklace and was covered in what appeared to be white runes. I took Ella's hand and continued walking to my truck while responding, "No thank you. I already spent enough money inside. I don't need to spend anything else." She continued behind us, insisting, "Please, just try it on, sir." She sounded more desperate now. "I think it will be good for you." I got Ella inside my truck and began walking to the driver's side, trying to avoid eye contact with the strange woman and reaffirming that I wasn't interested. I couldn't explain it, but the woman being so close to me now was driving me insane. It was like my emotions were being gutted. The closer she got, the worse I felt. I wanted nothing more than to get away from her. As I reached for the handle of my door, I saw the woman's hand reach out and grab my arm before hearing her pleading. "Please, sir, I know you don't tend to understand, but I need you to take this and wear it. There is..." I pulled back my hand roughly and snapped. "Don't you dare grab me like that, you weirdo. I have no clue who the hell you are or why you want me to have your stupid Etsy project, but it's not happening. Go find some other loser to sell your cheap junk to." It was as though her touch flipped a switch in me. The sadness, the gutted feeling, was replaced with anger that exploded out of me. I climbed into my truck and slammed the door. Immediately I felt off about what I had said. Even in incredibly uncomfortable and less than favorable situations, I am always very calm and never aggressive or insulting to people. Ella, seeing how odd I acted and how upset I was, placed her hand on my arm. Let's get home, okay? I nodded and began backing out of the parking space. After backing out, I put my truck into drive and looked forward to now see the woman standing in the parking space we just pulled out of. In my headlights, I could see her clearly, clutching the black beads to her chest, with a face that looked like she hadn't slept in days. As the light shined on her, I noticed something else that I hadn't before. Her eyes were filled with tears. As I looked into her sorrow-filled eyes for a moment, I considered going and taking the necklace from her. However, this feeling was quickly replaced by the same abnormal anger I felt before. Crazy bitch, I hissed under my breath before speeding off. That night was the first night the dream came to me. The memory of it fragmented, nothing more than fading flashes. An empty void, a dark forest, a twig breaking behind me, turning to see what it was, and then waking up. Dreams are a strange thing. The memory of the dream was as though I had no feeling of fear, but upon waking from it, I was left in a cold sweat, breathing as though I had a near-death experience. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 12 a.m. exactly. Things started getting strange over the next few weeks. To say my luck was bad would be an understatement. It started off small. My phone would go missing only to find it a few hours later in a place I had already looked. Glasses being too close to the edge of the counter and falling off, those sorts of things. As time went on though, the misfortune became more serious. I'd get ready for work only to spend 30 minutes looking for my keys, only to realize my wallet is now missing right after I found the keys, making me late and putting me in bad standings with my boss. I would go to submit an assignment for one of my college classes, just to find the files I was using somehow got corrupted, and I would have to start all over. I even had weird stuff like multiple birds flying into my windows and breaking their necks, something that always upset me as a big animal lover. These things happened sparsely in the first few weeks, but after the first month they became more frequent. Every time these misfortunes would happen, I would feel anger and sadness welling up more and more. All of this was further fed by tiredness that came from being woken up every few days at exactly the same time by a dream that made no sense. Once those emotions subsided, I would be left with a growing emptiness in me. I'm ashamed to say it, but the stress and anger lead me to push everyone away. I suddenly had no time for friends, and little time for Ella. When I was around the people I cared for, I was left with this deflated feeling that made me a husk of the happy person I once was. After 2 months, I felt like I had become a completely different person. I have never believed in the paranormal. I loved the idea of ghosts and spirits, but I never believed those things could actually exist. I chalked up what was happening to me as a string of bad luck, mixed with mood swings from stress and lack of sleep. Ella was the first one to suggest something paranormal might be happening. Unlike me, Ella was actually open-minded to the idea of paranormal stuff, and even believed in it to at least some extent. With my terrible luck and even worse mood, she wondered if I somehow got into something bad. I don't know if she fully believed it herself, or if she was grasping at anything to get her boyfriend back. There are a lot of things in this world that we can't explain, and tons of people have encounters with things that they swear are otherworldly. What if something is messing with you? Ella said, showing me an article on curses and hauntings. I said I'm ashamed to say, but I laughed at her when she suggested it. I don't know why I did it. I always try to hear her out on everything with an open mind, but hearing the paranormal suggested made something inside me stir. It was so out of character and mean-spirited of me, but I laughed at her. "Are you serious?" I asked sarcastically. "Yes." "Okay, cool. What is it then? Was it Casper or the gnomes that kept hiding my keys?" Being serious. "No, you said you're not." My voice raised. "You are sitting here bringing up fairy tales and magic to explain to me why everything in my life sucks right now. All I want is to be left alone so I don't have to listen to people make excuses for something that is just bad luck." It was a lie. I didn't want her to go. Why am I being such a jerk? I thought. I'm just throwing out ideas. I'm trying to help you, she said quietly. Well, at least I'm not the only one losing my mind. Immediately, I came to my senses about how awful I was being. I tried to apologize, but the damage was already done. If you want to be miserable, you can be, Ella said, but you don't instead have to make everyone miserable with you." She stormed out while I tried backpedaling what I said, digging a hole deeper for myself. When Ella slammed the door behind her, and I was alone in my house again, the sinking feeling of guilt was almost unbearable. I stood there for a few minutes, pacing around the kitchen, looking at my phone, debating if I should call her and try to make things right. Ella was the only person who was trying to help me, the only person who knew everything going on in my life, and I pushed her away for trying to be there for me. "Why did you push her away?" I thought. "You star so pathetic. You let a little bad luck drive everyone you care about away. You star worthless. Less than worthless. You would have more use in the ground than going on with this miserable excuse for a life." I had never been suicidal in my whole life. These thoughts, they were alien to me. Yet for a moment, they made sense. My head was flooded with images, all the ways I could do it. Feeling that way, hearing the voice in my head say these things, it was terrifying. The depression and guilt I felt in that moment was almost unbearable. I put my phone back in my pocket, and I fell on my hands and knees, and sobbed. And there, in my sorrow, grief, and self-pity, I noticed something. The room seemed darker. No, not the whole room, just a small area shadowed around me. "What?" I gasped, looking at the strange shadow around me. It didn't make any sense. I was lying right under the kitchen light. The only way there could be a shadow around me was if someone was behind me blocking the light. Immediately a feeling came to the forefront of my mind, one that I had been experiencing for weeks, but was so faint I didn't even notice until now. I was being watched, and whoever it was is right behind me. I spun around with my hands in front of me. I expected to see some person dressed in all black with a knife or gun, but instead, I was faced with nothing but the glaring light bulb of the kitchen light fixture. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of not being alone was stronger than ever. I shot to my feet, my still wet eyes jittering around the room, looking for a sign of anyone. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound threatening, even though whoever would have been there was just listening to me cry like a toddler. "I'm not messing around. I know someone is here. Come out and face me, I demand." I really, really wish I hadn't said. After I finished speaking, I heard something in my kitchen cabinet, the sound of glass breaking. At first, it was a small crack. Then I heard a glass shatter, then another. "What the hell?" I whispered in a shaking voice, frozen, unable to comprehend the impossibility of what was happening. Suddenly, the cabinet flew open, and shreds of broken plates and glasses were thrown out towards me. I ducked when the cabinet door opened, so most of the glass missed me, but a few shards managed to land on the top of me and left a few cuts on my scalp and arms. Immediately, I ran out of the kitchen and into my bedroom. Even though I couldn't see it, I could feel it, its presence. It was inches behind me as I ran. It was like I could feel heat radiating off of it as I ran through the entrance to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door. I moved inside the bathroom to find something to treat my cuts. I reached for my phone. I needed to call the police, to call Ella, to call anyone who could come and help me. My phone was gone. "What? No. I whimpered as I patted myself all over, looking for my phone. I had put it in my pocket. Where the hell could it have gone? As I looked over my bedroom for my phone, a loud thud came from my door, followed by another and another. The thuds were getting louder, and I could see the door start to buckle and shake under weight of whatever was doing this. I knew whatever the thing was, it was going to get into the bedroom eventually. In my desperation, I locked myself in the bathroom with the lights turned off. I heard the bedroom door crack, and then break open. The silence that followed the sound of the door breaking was maddening. I couldn't hear footsteps or breathing. I could see from under the door the light of the bedroom flicker before hearing the bulb shatter, as I was drowned in complete darkness. The immersing silence was broken by the sound of the doorknob to the bathroom being tested gently, followed by 3 quiet taps. "Please. I don't know what you want. I don't know what I did wrong. I said I'm sorry," I cried softly. "Please, just leave me alone. I just want you to leave me alone." My pleads were met with the sound of something hitting the door hard before falling to the ground. At first, I wondered what it could have thrown at the door, but my question was answered a few minutes later as a familiar ringtone filled the quiet room. It was my phone. What's more, The ringtone was a special ringtone I set up for when Ella calls me. The help I needed was calling me. All I had to do was open the door and answer. Maybe it was waiting right outside the door, or maybe it had already left the room. There was no way for me to know. I couldn't do it. I couldn't open that door. My help would have to wait. I bandaged myself up the best I could before I laid on the cold floor and cried until all the energy left my body and I somehow fell asleep. There, I dreamed. I was falling through a black void. I could see my body, but everything around me was as black as an empty night sky. I've never had a fear of heights, but I've never been the most comfortable around them either. Fear of the eventual sudden stop grew and grew as I plummeted. I screamed as I fell. I pictured my friends, my family. I pictured Ella. I didn't want to die. Suddenly, the rushing wind on my back and feeling of falling stopped, replaced with the crunchy cushion of dead leaves and the chirping of crickets while I looked up at a forest canopy covering a bright night sky. It was as if I was never falling to begin with. I stood to my feet, the fear of the falling and the memory of the presence in my home still weighing on me. However, in the calm of the forest, I remembered that I had been here before, almost every night. The falling, the forest. It has plagued my mind every day for weeks. Only this time, it was clearer. I had more understanding of where I was, and that I was asleep on the bathroom floor. Crunch. I remembered this. A noise approaching from behind, one that if I turned to face, the dream would end, a mistake I didn't want to make. Crunch. As the noise drew closer, my fear grew. However, the presence behind me had an air of calm, of peace, of comfort. It felt different from the thing I was running from moments ago. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Crunch. "Please, just let me go." I cried. "I just want to be okay again." Behind me I heard a voice from my memory that I had forgotten, a voice whose memory shot to the forefront of my mind. The voice of the woman from the Renaissance Fair. "Come find me," she said sternly. "How can I find you, Maria?" Maria? I knew her name. She never told it to me, but I knew it somehow. "Come find me," she said again. I turned to face her only to wake up on the bathroom floor. I didn't know how long I had been asleep for, but I needed to get out of the house. I needed to get to Ella. She could help me find Maria. I opened the bathroom door, picking up my phone and checking the time. 12 a.m. My room was a mess. My bedroom door was broken open. My pillows and bed were shredded. All the lamps and light bulbs in the room were broken. A pattern I assumed would spread throughout the house. As I moved out of the bedroom, I opened my phone to call Ella. She wouldn't like being woken up, but she would understand. As I rounded the corner into my kitchen, I dropped my phone in the shock of what I saw. In my mind, I assumed this presence that was tormenting me was formless. Something that could physically affect things, but not be seen. I don't know why I thought this, but that assumption was dashed as I looked at the monster in front of me. The thing stood between me and the door leading to the garage. It was tall enough to have to hunch over to stand in my kitchen, making it well over 8 feet tall. Despite its height, the being was unnaturally slender, having the same width dimensions of an average thin person. Its skin, if you can call it skin, was like ink. It looked wet and oily. A light from the street shimmered off of its black form. Its head was shaped similar to a bird's. It was round, with what looked like a hooked beak over what I can only assume is a wide gaping mouth with no teeth. I turned to run, too afraid to even scream. Before I had even made 3 steps towards the back door, the creature had grabbed me. Its long, slender hands had wrapped around my head and pulled me back, forcing me onto my back. I could feel it now. Its skin was slick and wet, like grabbing at latex covered in dish soap. It placed its hand in my mouth and forced it open. I could taste it, like the taste when you accidentally breathe in sunscreen mixed with cinnamon. Then I felt it, a pouring into my mouth. It was as though the thing was melting down my throat. I choked, I cried, but I couldn't move. Even as the monster shrank and melted into me, I could still feel its strength holding me down. Eventually, the stress of the situation became too much, and I passed out. When I woke up on the floor the next morning, I felt like I had the worst chest congestion possible. I jumped to my feet and coughed over the sink, coughing up a mixture of phlegm, blood, and a black oily substance. I called Ella and told her that I needed to see her in public right then. I told her that I was sorry for what I said, and that she was right, and that I needed her help more than ever. She could have said no. She could have called me crazy, but she didn't. She just asked how she could help. I assumed the thing knew more people would get involved if it started throwing things around in public, and since it waited until Ella left the other night before lashing out, I imagined it didn't want more people involved. So I figured being in public would be my best shot at keeping it restrained. I met up with Ella at a coffee shop and explained everything to her. The cuts, the dream, what the thing did to me. I don't think she fully believed me at first, but her mind changed when I coughed up the strange black liquid into a napkin. I think it's trying to break me down, I said. Why? What does it need you broken down for? I have no clue, but it Steph's working. I Steph not myself anymore. Even you, Steph, noticed that. Ella sipped her coffee. And how do you feel now? Terrible. How so? It makes me want to die. What? Ella's eyes widened, setting her coffee down. Yeah, like when you left the other night. I think the thing was trying to convince me to. I hung my head, unable to finish the sentence. What about that woman? Ella asked. Maria? I don't know. She has been there since it started, though, I answered. Do you think she could have started all this? Maybe. Or maybe she wants to stop it. All I know is that she wants me to find her. So that is what we Stacks are going to do. It took a while of scouring Facebook and Instagram before we found her. Turns out there are a lot of Marias in my area, but eventually there she was. Maria Windsor. Her page was filled with spiritualist crafts and inspirational messages. She looked happier in her pictures than how I remembered seeing her. But it was her. I sent her a friend request, and within a few minutes, she accepted and sent a message. It was an address with the words, "Get here quickly." When we arrived at the address, we saw it was just an ordinary house in a completely unassuming neighborhood. Despite its unassuming nature, the thing that had latched onto me did not like me being there. The coughing was getting worse and worse the closer I got to the house. Walking up to her front door was an ordeal in and of itself. Eventually, I stopped at the steps to the door. I couldn't catch my breath. I couldn't stop coughing and spitting up that vile black liquid. At a certain point, I questioned if this was how I would die. On the doorstep of a mystery I would never understand. As my vision started to go dark, I saw the door to the house open and the fuzzy image of a woman approaching me. When I came to, I was lying on a couch with Ella staring at me from across the room with a worried expression. Sitting on the coffee table in front of me was Maria. "It's nice to see you again, Mason," Maria said with a small smile. "Maria," I groaned, still waking up. "Here, drink this," she said, handing me a glass of water. I sat up and took the water from her. It was then that I noticed the necklace of black beads around my neck. "You got here just in time. Any later, and it would have started fully taking you," Maria said, her voice very matter-of-fact and direct. "What is it?" I asked. "Some say evil spirit, some say demon. It's something non-human, not from our plane, something that hates us." "Yes," I asked. "Humans," she replied quickly. "It hates people." "Why?" Maria shrugged. "Who knows? It could be a number of reasons, but it and things like it don't usually speak to us candidly with people." "What does it want?" I asked quietly. "Your death." Her words cut me like a knife. I looked around the rooms. It was filled with oddities like crystals, incense burners, sigils, herbs, and different colored strings. I could also see religious paraphernalia scattered throughout the room. Things like crucifixes, rosary beads, and what I assume was holy water. "Who are you?" I asked. "Someone who wants to help you." "But why?" "As I know what it's like to lose someone to this thing, and I don't want to see anyone else suffer because of it." Maria looked at Ella, who was clearly still shaken up from what had happened on the doorstep. I reached up and touched the necklace. I could almost feel warmth radiating off of it. "This wards it off," I muttered. "That's why you were trying to give it to me." Maria frowned. "It would have. But judging by the black shit you sit her coughing up, I said I'm going to go out on a limb and say the thing has already infested you. At this point, all it does is weaken it." "How did you reach me in my dream?" I asked. "Astral projection," she said. "I tried almost every night to reach you. The problem is the spirit is a strong one, and it would block our link. Your girlfriend filled me in on the night I was able to reach you. I guess the spirit used up too much energy torturing you and it wasn't strong enough to block the link. What can we do to fix this? I asked. At this point, Maria said, the spirit is too close to taking you over. We said you're going to have to get it out of you by force. I had seen and heard of exorcisms in all sorts of fictional media. I never believed it was a real thing, let alone that one day I would be the one strapped to a table shirtless, with what I can only assume is a witch, and my girlfriend standing around me. The room was decorated with more oddities than the living room was. The 2 doors in and out of the room had ornate crucifixes hanging over them, and the whole room was lined with red string. The shelves in the room were covered in bottles filled with different herbs and spices, and the edges of the floor were covered in a pristine line of salt. This will be a very unpleasant experience for you, Maria said somberly. Your mind will be taken closer to the spirit's worlds. You will see and feel things that are imperceivable to us. It will be a lot to take in. But that is why it is good that she's here. Maria said this while looking at Ella. She'll keep you grounded. Despite the gravity of the words Maria was speaking to me, her cadence and delivery were like that of a doctor describing an invasive surgery to a patient. She spoke like she had done this many times before. I squeezed Ella Sip's hand. I stopped ready. Maria winced in a way that told me I wasn't set. Then let's begin, she said calmly. Maria began to burn incense and chant quietly in a language that I couldn't understand. I gave Ella a worried glance just before the smell of the incense accosted my nose. Neither Maria nor Ella reacted to the smell, but to me it reeked of rot and spoiled milk. I could feel its smoke burning in my lungs. The smell was accompanied by an equally strange sight. The room suddenly looked as though everything was completely covered in shadow. It reminded me of when your phone is on, but you don't touch it for a long time, and the screen goes dim before turning off. The sight and smell were enough to freak me out. I was breathing heavily and squeezed Ella's hand tighter as she looked down at me with a nervous stare. After a few minutes of this, I began to feel a stirring in my chest. I needed to cough, but I couldn't sit up to cough the mess in my lungs out of me. Then I felt it, a pressing on my chest. When I looked down though, I realized it wasn't something pressing on my chest. It was something inside of my chest, pressing out. I could feel the subtle touch of fingertips rubbing against the inside of my ribcage. What the hell is that? I whispered. Maria continued her chanting, and Ella just squeezed my hand, looking at the spot on my chest that I was looking. I could now feel what felt like the palm of someone's hand pushing up on my ribcage. The discomfort it caused was unnatural. I lurched on the table and let out a yell. Maria's chants grew louder as Ella stumbled back, frightened by my screams. I looked down to now see several small pointy objects pushing out the skin between my ribs. I screamed out and looked away as black, inky fingertips broke through the skin with a hideous pop. I could feel small streams of liquid streaming down my sides. The strangest thing was that, despite feeling the pressure, there was no pain coming from the wounds, only the mental anguish from watching my own body's mutilation. I watched in horror as the fingers retreated back into my chest as I felt 2 palms now pressing up on the inside of my chest. After a few more moments of hearing nothing but my screaming and Maria's chanting, a new horrifying sound came to my ears, cracking. I could hear my ribs breaking inside of me as the pushing continued. I couldn't bear to look down as I heard the tearing of my skin, sounding like dull knives going through wet leather. I looked around the room in panicked agony to see Maria and Ella with sprays of my blood across them. However, Maria kept chanting, and Ella stayed still. As I felt my chest open more, I could also now feel something much bigger than hands pushing through. I looked down just in time to see the head and shoulders of the spirit push from my mangled torso with an awful screech, my crimson blood running off its shining black exterior. Its piercing cry made my ears ring out in pain. The first true pain I had felt since the exorcism began. The pain from the demon's scream worked its way down my body. It was as though it woke up a part of me, so I could now feel the pain radiating from the damage it had done to my chest. I closed my eyes and screamed out in pain, begging for the anguish to stop, wondering if there was any way out. When I opened my eyes, the being was bent down over me, half of its body still submerged in me, its abominable head just inches from mine. I could feel its offer running through my soul. It would take the pain away, it would end the suffering. All it wanted was for me to give it control. For a moment, I wanted to say yes, I wanted to end this nightmare, to get away from everything. Death was preferable to me than this. I tensed my mouth, prepared to scream my answer, to let it know that it had won, to let it know it had broken me. Then, in all the pain and agony, I felt a familiar warm hand gently grab my arm. I looked to see Ella, with tears streaming down her face, knelt down beside me and speaking softly to me. "Keep going. Please," she said through broken cries. "I need you to keep going for me. I love you, Mason." As I looked into her eyes, for just a moment, I felt the pain leave and a calmness wash over me. In that brief moment, I mustered the strength to whisper 4 simple words. "I want to live." I screamed out a cry of pain as the demon trashed back and screeched at my answer, the rest of its torso and legs forming from the black sludge that filled my chest. I watched as the spirit rose up out of me and dissipated into black mist in the air. My vision grew dark, and I watched the world go black. As I shot upright on the couch, my hands instinctively went to my chest. I could feel my heart beating quickly against my perfectly intact ribs, no dried blood or scars in sight. I looked up, confused, just in time to see a sobbing Ella jump on me and hugged me so tightly that I struggled to breathe. "You did good," Maria said, sipping what looked like tea from across the room. I struggled to speak. I saw it. It ripped. How am I? What you saw and felt was the purging of your spirit. Things that we couldn't perceive. To us, you were just thrashing and screaming. "So it's Set's really gone?" Ella asked. "For him it is," Maria sighed. "Unfortunately, keeping something like that out of our plane permanently is much more difficult." "Thank you, Maria," I muttered. Maria nodded and went back into her kitchen. For the most part, life went back to normal after that. I had to really patch things up with my boss and push myself like crazy to catch back up in school, but I managed, especially with Ella and my friends by my side. I could have given up. I could have let it win, but I didn't. I pushed forward and found hope. Hope in the ones I love and the ones that love me. I am writing down what happened to me now as a message. If somehow, somewhere, there is someone out there reading this who is fighting this evil spirit, keep fighting. And if you run into some lady who is offering you strange black beads, for the love of God, take them. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. By every metric, I was a shitty Marine. In my 4-year career, I had never scored higher than a second-class PFT. I never went to my MOS's advanced school. I was NJP'd twice, and non-recs for promotion more times than I can count. I barely picked up Lance Corporal, and everyone gets promoted to Lance Corporal. According to my squad leader, section leader, platoon sergeant, and company first sergeant, I have an attitude and motivation problem. They weren't wrong. I don't truly know why I would behave the way I did. Maybe it was just a lack of maturity. I joined the Marine Corps when I was 17, trying to get out of a bad situation back home. I had a troubled childhood, and I had hoped the Marines would be a way for me to move forward. Well, as it turns out, people with troubled childhoods will typically have troubled adulthoods. Every shitty thing I did as a kid, I did as a Marine. Drinking, stealing, getting into fights, being disrespectful to authority figures. Typical bullshit you'd expect from a shitbag terminal lance. By 3.5 years in, my leadership had given up on me. Whatever, I thought. I only had 6 months left anyway. Our unit was getting ready to set out on its yearly field exercise at a training area a few hundred miles away from our base. I'm not going to name what unit or base I was at, or the training area for the sake of operational security. I guess old habits die hard. As I expected, as soon as we arrived at the training area, I was placed on camp tax. For those of you not in the know, camp tax is essentially where the unit would place all the shitbags such as myself to do bitch work around the cantonment area, picking up trash, cleaning toilets, working in the chow hall, and other such tasks. What I didn't expect was to be placed on AHA watch. AHA means ammunition handling area, and in accordance with USMC regulations, it's far as fuck away from everything else. I, along with 19 other independently minded Marines, were given 2-man tents and several boxes of MREs, and were placed in a 7-ton heading several miles away from cantonment. What makes AHA watch so shitty is, aside from the fact that it's in the middle of nowhere, which says a lot, Because the training area itself was also in the middle of nowhere, is that we had to sleep outside. This base was in the mountains and it got cold as fuck at night. And there was no hot shower, no showers, no bathrooms, aside from the overflowing porta-shitters. And most pertinent to me, no PX. I had only brought out 1 pack of Marlboros before we had left our base, and I had 0 snacks. I would have to sustain myself solely on MREs for the next month and a half. Not to mention the fact that my only company would be almost 2 dozen shitbags and all of the wild goats that lived out in those mountains. On the ride over, I pondered what I could have done to be condemned to this forsaken duty. There was a long list of things to choose from. Was it because I fell asleep on duty? Was it because I got kicked off the last rifle qual range for being a safety violator? Was it because I wrote "fuck Podges" on the wall of the radio battalion's barracks? I concluded that it was probably a combination of all 3. As soon as we got to the AHA, a wide dirt field inundated with green shipping containers, filled with various types of ammunition, we quickly set up our tents. As soon as we were done, we were put to work unloading the containers. Alpha Company had their first range in a week, so obviously we had to get their ammunition ready now. After several hours of toiling, we finally finished, and I shambled back to my tent to unwind. This was my daily routine for the next few weeks. Wake up, shave, eat chow, remove ammunition from shipping containers, unload spent shells and cartridges from the backs of JLTVs, and 7 tons. Load the aforementioned ammunition into the aforementioned JLTVs, and 7 tons. Eat chow, go to sleep. Rinse and repeat, day in, day out. After one particularly grueling day of indentured servitude, all I wanted to do was smoke a cigarette. I had been pretty good at rationing them, and I had 1 left. Sergeant Hart, the NCO in charge of the AHA, had promised us that he would get us a ride back to Cantonment so we could go to the PX, so I could restock then. I walked back to my tent, and right away I knew something was wrong. My tent was open. I scurried over and looked inside. My cigarettes were gone. Fucking thieves, I thought. As I pondered what I was going to do, I heard laughter. I glanced over in the direction where it came from, and I saw Davidson standing in the smoke pit, smoking a cigarette. I knew for a fact that he ran out of smokes a week ago, and no one here liked him enough to give him one of theirs. Rage growing inside of me, I stomped towards him. In hindsight, I could have handled that better. I won't go into too much detail, but the situation ended with Davidson being taken back to Cantonment to see the corpsman and me being put on fire watch all night. I was going to have fire watch for multiple hours every night for the rest of the time we were out there. Fuck. Sergeant Hart made me the roving watch, so I had to walk around the perimeter of the AHA for 3 hours every night. This was a position he specifically created just for me. After a few nights of this, I was joined by Davidson. He ended up being alright. All he had was a black eye. He was going to join me every night on roving watch because he instigated our fight by stealing my cigarette. It was a little awkward at first, having to spend several hours every night walking around in a circle with a guy I knocked out. But after a while the awkwardness dissipated, and soon we were talking and laughing like old friends. Him bringing me a pack of Marlboros to make up for the one he stole certainly helped. A few days after we were condemned to fire watch, something peculiar happened. A wild goat was found dead outside the AHA. The goat was discovered about 200 meters down the road from the AHA. It was a ghastly scene. It was all torn up. Its limbs were stripped of flesh almost down to the bone, and the strangest thing to me was that its head was missing. Because it was discovered on the road, everyone's first assumption was that it was hit by a truck, but that didn't make any sense. The speed limit on these roads was 15 miles per hour, and it was highly enforced by the chain of command. With how much the road winds and curves, I don't think any military vehicle could even go beyond 20 miles per hour. A truck hitting a goat at 15 miles per hour wouldn't do that kind of damage. After Davidson and I hauled the goat off the side of the road, everyone quickly forgot about it, writing it off as some sort of strange anomaly. Things continued normally for a few more days, until another goat was discovered in the same state as the first. Someone postulated that there may be some sort of wolf or coyote in the area, and that what had killed the goats. That would make more sense than our first theory, as it did look like some sort of animal had gotten to the goat. But like our first theory, there were problems with it. According to our wildlife safety brief, the goats living in the training area were an invasive species with no natural predators. The state had to occasionally bring in hunters to thin their numbers. Someone else suggested that perhaps a hunter was responsible for the goat's death, but we quickly dismissed that idea. Hunters weren't allowed to hunt while there were units training. This went on for the next few days. Dead goats, all mutilated beyond recognition, were turning up around the AHA. Every time they were discovered a few dozen meters closer, I suggested to Sergeant Hart that we should call the COC and tell them what was going on, but he flatly refused. Apparently, Sergeant Hart got into some trouble because of the fight I got into, and now company leadership was questioning his competence. He was up for promotion to staff sergeant and didn't want another incident out here to jeopardize that. I tried to protest, but I stopped myself. I knew from experience that an argument between a sergeant and a lance corporal only ended one way. More days pass, more maimed goats, their corpses inching closer and closer to our sanctuary. During our watch, me and Davidson would try and see what was causing the depopulation of the local goat community, but we never could. It was too dark. Our tiny flashlights only shone so far, and our NVGs were back in the armory in cantonment. It was a complete mystery to us, until one night, during our watch, we were talking, just shooting the shit, when we heard a shrill scream. It sounded just like a person. We both jumped and spun toward the direction of the scream. We both let out a sigh of relief to see it was just a goat, standing on a hill, illuminated by the moonlight, about 20 meters away from us. Those old YouTube videos are right. A goat's scream sounds just like a human. Davidson started to approach the goat to scare it off. They weren't allowed in the AHA. As he was halfway to the goat, yelling at it to go away, the goat was suddenly pulled away behind the hill by something we didn't see. Davidson did an about-face and sprinted back to where we were standing and past me, leaving me there standing frozen in terror. The goat kept screaming and screaming until eventually it was silenced, presumably by whatever had taken it. I stood there frozen in place, too stunned by what I had just witnessed to move. My trance was only broken when Davidson grabbed me from behind and tried to pull me back into the AHA. He must have realized I hadn't been running with him, and he came back for me. We immediately woke up Sergeant Hart and told him what we saw. He didn't believe us, or at least not completely. He told us that it must have been a wolf, or coyote, or bear, and that it wouldn't bother us because they were afraid of people. He knew damn well that none of those animals lived out here. He just didn't care. He told us to get back on watch, or he would make this last week we were here a living hell. Me and Davidson begrudgingly went back on post, but this time we didn't talk or joke around. We just lay in the prone, our unloaded rifles pointing in the direction of our unseen enemy. We found what was left of the goat the next morning, just behind the hill. All day the next day, we begged Sergeant Hart not to put us on watch outside the perimeter of the AHA. We argued that it was unnecessary from a security standpoint, as there was a tall fence that surrounded the AHA. He told us that he didn't care, and that it was our punishment for fighting each other and embarrassing him. We then offered to stand fire watch the whole night. Every night for the last few days we were here, just behind the fence. Me and Davidson both sighed in relief when he agreed to those terms. It was exhausting having to stand a full 8-hour shift every night for the rest of the week, but it was worth it. We had hoped what Sergeant Hart had said was true, and that whatever that was, it would be afraid of people and not try to enter the AHA. It never did, but we were glad that we would be leaving in a few days, so we didn't have to find out if it would. Things were looking up. The field exercise was over. I had survived being out in the wilderness for a month and a half, and as soon as I got back to our base, I would be starting the process of getting out of the Marines. Things were good. Everything went to shit on that last night. The night had started pretty good. Sergeant Hart had decided that after a month of constantly being on watch, we had learned our lesson, and he gave us the night off. I went to bed that night, happy to be getting the first full 8 hours of sleep in since we got out there. My slumber was interrupted by something I had become accustomed to, Sergeant Hart's angry screaming. "What do you mean he's gone?" Sergeant Hart barked at the young PFC. "I don't know, Sergeant." I looked inside his tent to get him for his watch, and he was gone. The PFC stuttered back. Private Locke had a pretty hard time in the Marine Corps, and that's saying something coming from me. Locke had trouble adjusting to the rigors of life in the infantry, and to make a long story short, he couldn't do it. Since he had arrived at the unit a few months ago, he was the constant victim of bullying and hazing. To cope with this, he turned to self-mediation. He popped on a piss test right before we came out here. and he was due to be kicked out with an other than honorable discharge when we returned. According to one of the other Marines present, Locke had mentioned that he was going to go AWOL and catch a flight back home. The Marine thought he was joking and didn't think anything of it. Now a few hours later, Locke's tent was empty and his day pack was gone. Great. This is the last fucking thing I needed, Sergeant Hart growled. He then turned to me and said, "You, Davidson, and PFC dumbass, here are going to go find him and bring him back." I immediately objected. "Sergeant, you can't be serious. It's the middle of the night, it's dark as fuck out, and we don't know which way he went. We need to call this in." I didn't mention the real reason I didn't want to go, because I knew he still didn't believe me. "Fuck, no," Sergeant Hart snapped. "If I call this into the COC, I stet fucked, which by extension means you stetch all fucked. Shit rolls downhill." I doubted that any of this could be blamed on the rest of this. Aside from the guys who previously stood firewatch and didn't stop him from leaving, and the guy who heard Locke mention he was leaving and didn't say anything. For the first time in my Marine Corps career, I was entirely blameless for a bad situation. Sergeant Hart could tell I knew this, and sighed. Look, he couldn't have gone that far, and if I had to guess, the idiot probably took the main road back towards Cantonment. If you move quickly, you'll catch him. I can't go because I'm the NCO in charge. I can't leave the rest of the Marines here, unattended. For all I know, if I leave, more people would run off. Sergeant Hart gave me a pleading look. Aside from myself, you Sipter, the most senior guy here. I trust you to get this done. In hindsight, I shouldn't have let that convince me to go. I should have grabbed the radio myself and called it in, and let Hart get fucked over, but I didn't. Throughout my time in the Marines, I had always been treated deservedly as an incompetent individual who couldn't be trusted with any sort of responsibility. So having a sergeant give me an actual important task and tell me he trusted me to complete it convinced me. After all that time, despite all my shitbaggery, I still had some sense of motivation. Myself, Davidson, and Scott, the PFC, who discovered that Locke was missing, sent out down the dirt road back toward Cantonment, the route Sergeant Hart had believed Locke had gone. Davidson had agreed to go with me because he figured that there was strength in numbers, that whatever was out there killing the goats could have killed us all in the AHA, but didn't, because it must have been afraid of large groups of people. Scott came with us because he was a boot and would do whatever the fuck we told him to do. Sergeant Hart told us that if we didn't find Locke within an hour, we could call him on the 152 and then he would radio it in as a last resort. At the time, that felt reasonable. As we made our way down the road, me and Davidson kept our heads on a swivel, on the lookout not only for Locke, but whatever ungodly nightmare that may be lurking in the shadows. It was a cold night like always, and for once the sky was clear of clouds. It had almost been an hour since we left, and all three of us were ready to call the sergeant and tell him we had failed. I brought the radio to my ear and pressed the key-in button. Echo 5 Hotel, this is Echo 3 Tango, radio check. I said into the radio. Static. Echo 5 Hotel, this is Echo 3 Tango, radio check. I said again. Static. Echo 5 Hotel, this is... I was cut off by 3 loud beeps emitted from the radio. I looked at the radio's display to see the bar representing the radio's battery life was just a small sliver. Fuck, I exclaimed angrily. I exchanged a glance with Davidson. Did you happen to bring an extra battery? I asked. He gave me an annoyed look. You stood the one carrying the radio. You stood the one in charge of having batteries. I sighed. He was right. Damn it, the first time I was ever entrusted with something important, and I already fucked up the most basic thing. No wonder I kept getting non-rested. We should probably head back. Scott piped up. Sergeant Hart is expecting us to call him soon, and if he doesn't sit here from us, he so assumes something happened. If we run, we can probably get back in 20 minutes. He sets right, Davison chimed in. If Sergeant doesn't stud hear back from us, he said'll be more pissed than before. I reluctantly agreed. I knew Sergeant Hart would be angry that we couldn't find Locke, but at that point I didn't care. I was getting out in a few months. Soon all of this would just be a shitty memory to add to my collection of shitty memories. Alright, let's get. I was cut off by a shrill shriek that pierced through the night air. All three of us turned and faced the direction of the noise. Standing on top of a small hill adjacent to the road, illuminated by the moonlight, was Locke. He looked ragged and dirty, like he had just gotten out of a 2-week field op with zero rest, and his uniform was torn to shreds and covered in blood. He was panting and gasping for air, like he had just run a marathon, and he on his knees, like he had just crawled up the other side of the hill. "Locke, you dumbass boot," I said, ignoring his disheveled appearance. "Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere for you." I growled at him. I really don't know what had come over me. Perhaps it was all the anger and frustration building up over my entire mediocre career, compounded by the month and a half spent out in the field, finally boiling over. I laid into Locke. "When we get back to the AHA, I said I'm personally going to fuck you up. Then Sergeant Hartsep's going to fuck you up. And then when we get back to Cantonment." My tirade was cut off by the animal that pounced on Locke. That's the best way I can describe it. An animal, although it didn't look like any animal I had ever seen. If I had to describe it in greater detail, I say it was a cross between multiple different animals. It had the head of a bat, the body of a man, and the claws of a mountain lion. Claws that were currently tearing into Private Locke's torso and ripping out his spine. Me and Davidson immediately booked it. We ran back down the road towards the AHA. After about 100 meters, I realized Scott wasn't with us. He must have done what I did the first time I encountered this thing, and froze up. I turned back just in time to see the creature decapitate him. I gagged and tried to resist the urge to vomit, which was not helped by the fact that this was the fastest I had ever run in my life. "Where sips Scott?" Davidson panted. "It fucking killed him," I gasped back. "Hart should have let us bring our fucking rifles," Davidson angrily exclaimed. Davidson tried to convince Sergeant Hart to let us bring our rifles and some ammunition, but he refused. He didn't want to risk us losing them, or having a negligent discharge. He insisted that if there was something out there, it probably wouldn't bother us. He was a sergeant, so he knew better than us. It felt like we were running for hours, but in reality, it must have only been a few minutes. I could see the lights of the AHA. We were so close. I figured that if we made it back, we would be safe, because it never tried to get into the AHA before. Maybe it did fear large groups of people. We just didn't bring enough with us. I noticed in my peripheral vision that Davidson had fallen behind me a bit. Davidson was not a good runner. The whole reason he was on AHA duty was because he failed the PFT. After a few more minutes of running, he fell to his knees, gasping for air. "Oh my God, fuck," he panted. "I can stet go on, I can stet breathe." I stopped and screamed at him. "Davidson, get the hell up. We stare almost there. I can stet breathe." He looked up at me with a pleading look. "Throw me on your back and carry me." I looked down at him and assessed the situation. Davidson was a big dude, and I was a pretty scrawny dude. Carrying him would slow me down tremendously. There was still just under a kilometer between us and the AHA. There was a chance I could get back to the AHA with him on my back. There was also a chance I wouldn't. I looked down the road. The Bat-Human hybrid was sprinting towards us. Even from a few hundred meters away, I could see its blood-soaked fangs. We had a head start on it, because it spent a few minutes devouring Scott's corpse. I was very winded at this point, and I realized if I wanted to survive, I would need another head start. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I left Davidson behind. My leadership was right. I was a terrible Marine. I had done the one thing a Marine is never supposed to do. I left another Marine behind to die to save my own life. Davidson kept screaming my name as I sprinted away from him. After I made it a few hundred meters away, he abruptly fell silent. I dashed through the front gate of the AHA, almost knocking over a very angry Sergeant Hart. I didn't stop to listen to whatever bullshit he was about to spew at me. I headed straight for the main radio. I pushed the boot radio operator to the side, picked up the microphone, and without any radio etiquette in mind whatsoever, I screamed, "Help," over and over again until I passed out. I was later told that I passed out from heat exhaustion, but based on the bruise on the back of my skull and the migraines that I suffer from to this day, I suspect Sergeant Hart bludgeoned me over the head with his rifle. My plea over the radio got some attention. When I woke up, I was in a naval hospital. As soon as I was awake, a nurse came in and told me to stay put, and that someone was going to speak to me. Before I could ask her for more information, she turned around and walked out. I tried to get up, but that's when I realized I was handcuffed to the bed. A few minutes later, a man in a suit entered the room. I don't think I'm allowed to go into full detail about what we spoke about, but what I can tell you is that officially, Private David Locke, Private First Class Lewis Scott, and Lance Corporal Matthew Davidson were killed by unexploded ordnance when they wandered off into the training area. I was told that I would be added to that casualty list if I didn't sign some papers saying that this was the case, and that I wouldn't speak about what I had experienced that night. I was told that everyone else present at the AHA was signing similar papers. I had no choice. All he told me about the creature I saw was that they were aware of its existence, and that the situation was under control. I left the Marine Corps a few months after that. By the grace of God, I somehow got out with an honorable discharge. I tried to forget that night and move on with my life. I started college, got a part-time job. I even took up reading as a hobby, which is something I never thought I'd do. This was all several years ago, and I thought I moved past that night and my time in the Marines as a whole, but recent events changed that. I kept in contact with a few of the guys who were there that night. Surprisingly, most are still in the fleet and are now NCOs. We didn't really talk about what happened. Most of them didn't really get the whole story, the whole real story anyway. A few months ago, someone posted an obituary in our group chat. It was for a Staff Sergeant Daniel Hart. According to the obituary, he was killed in a training accident at the same base where all of this shit went down. At first I thought it was karma at work. After all, he was the one who sent me and my friends to our deaths so he wouldn't get in trouble. But a few weeks later I saw on Facebook that another one of the Marines who was there that night died. According to the memorial post on Facebook, he had died from a congenital heart defect. I couldn't believe that. That Marine in question was a PT stud, and I doubted he could have been in the Marines for as long as he was without any symptoms showing. As the weeks went on, I kept seeing obituaries and memorial posts popping up, all for the guys who were at the AHA that night. The causes of death were all crazy things. Car accidents, training accidents, undiagnosed medical conditions, stuff like that. By my count, I'm the only one left, which is why I'm writing this. I don't think I have much time left. For the past few days, I've been locked in my room. I'm afraid to go outside. I'm being watched. From my window, I can occasionally see a black van drive by. I know it's the same one every time from the license plate, and I swear I can hear a helicopter fly by every so often. Helicopters have never flown by my apartment before last week. I'm praying to God that this is all just one big coincidence, and that I'm just losing my mind. What I do know that if this is all real, I'm not going to let them make my death look like an accident. I am perfectly healthy, I don't have any dangerous hobbies, and my job isn't dangerous. I am not planning on hurting myself. If they come for me, I'm going to fight. They won't be able to make it look like an accident. The waiting room was unnervingly still, a sterile chamber where even the slightest hint of warmth seemed to vanish. I sat on a stiff plastic chair, my eyes fixed on the blank television mounted on the wall, as the ceaseless hum of fluorescent lights underscored my isolation. The pervasive scent of antiseptic clung to the air, with each inhalation serving as a reminder of the clinical precision that had come to define this place. Above me, an old clock hung on the wall, a relic with ornate hands that defied logic. Its ticking was irregular, sometimes skipping a beat or even running backward for a split second, as if time itself were being tampered with. I found its behavior oddly hypnotic, a silent metronome to the growing dissonance around me. My thumb idly traced the familiar grooves of the old silver bracelet on my wrist. My wife's parting gift, once joked about as a way to remind me, just remember, you belong to me. Now its cool metal served as a bittersweet tether to a life I feared was slipping away. I was frozen there, watching the clock tick by, each irregular tick amplifying the pounding of my heart as an unsettling silence enveloped me. I could still hear that nurse's calm voice from earlier. "Don't worry, Mr. Baker. It only moves when you move." But as I stared at the operating room door, something felt seriously off. The usual hum of chatter was gone. I looked around and realized the nurse and everyone else had just vanished. The whole hospital felt empty, like I was the only soul left. I leaned forward and mumbled, "Who's there?" But my words were swallowed by a creeping silence, the erratic flicker of lights, and a strange pressure building in my head. That's when I noticed it, a rippling distortion at the edge of my vision, as if reality itself were torn open. There, Lounging in the periphery was a creature that defied explanation, an interdimensional presence whose form shimmered between hues and shadows, shifting in a way that made it seem neither entirely here nor there. Its unblinking gaze locked onto me, silent and menacing, daring me to make a move. For a long, heart-stopping moment, I stood paralyzed, caught in that creature's overwhelming stare. It moved slowly at first, almost languidly, its form undulating with an otherworldly fluidity, as if it were suspended between dimensions. Every second of that standoff made me feel as though my very soul were being measured against some ancient, incomprehensible standard. I knew instinctively that any movement might provoke it, a silent challenge laid out before me. Its eyes, cold and unyielding, seemed to command stillness, forcing me into an agonizing stalemate, remain frozen and face an eternal confrontation, or risk moving and unleash its wrath. The tension became unbearable, my heart hammered in my ears, and driven by a desperate need to escape, I forced myself to move. With trembling legs, I inched toward an open door down a dim corridor, each step a gamble against the creature's silent threat. Behind me, the clock's hands jerked unpredictably, a visual echo of my every faltering step. In that instant, the interdimensional being sprang into action. Its form shifted abruptly, darting after me with a speed that defied logic, a predatory sprint that blurred the boundaries of space and time. I caught only the eerie sound of its movement, as if it were tearing through the very fabric of reality. No longer a distant menace, it was right on my heels, its intense gaze burning into my back. I raced down those narrow halls, my footsteps echoing my mounting terror. Then, in a narrow stretch of corridor, as I desperately tried to outpace it, I tripped. In that split second, I felt its cold, otherworldly touch, a searing slash of pain along my forearm. The wound burned through my nerves with such intensity that my vision narrowed and the agony became unbearable. My legs buckled under the onslaught, and the overwhelming pain sent me spiraling into darkness. When I came to, harsh fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes. I was in a hospital bed, machines beeping in a sterile room that felt all too convincing. My thoughts raced, trying to stitch together the fragmented chaos of the chase, the excruciating pain of the wound, and that oppressive, silent corridor. Above the bed, the same erratic clock now loomed, its maddening dance of contorted hands, a constant reminder that time was no longer trustworthy. A gentle knock on the door pulled me from my disoriented reverie. A nurse entered, her smile crisp and unnervingly cheerful under the glare of the lights. Without missing a beat, she announced in a calm, measured tone, "Mr. Baker, the surgery went well." There was an unsettling precision in her words, as if they were part of a well-rehearsed script. As she adjusted the settings on the monitor, with meticulous efficiency, she added, "Your wife will be here soon." Her voice, too serene for the chaos I had just experienced, sent a shiver down my spine. The promise of her arrival, though meant to be reassuring, only deepened the uncanny dissonance that permeated every corner of my mind. The door creaked open, and there she stood. Yet as she stepped into the room, every movement felt unnaturally delayed, as if invisible strings were pulling her along. Then her voice, soft and insistent, cut through the sterile silence. "Honey, you don't have to be scared. This is the real deal. You remember everything, right? The hospital, the doctors, our love." My mind reeled, torn between the haunting memories of that waiting room and the gentle cadence of her words. "I don't get it," I stammered, voice trembling. "I saw things, felt something chasing me. That waiting room, it felt all too real." She moved closer, her hand reaching out as if to soothe my frayed nerves. "They were just illusions. Love your mind's way of shielding you from some hard truths. You're safe here. This is where you belong." Her words were hypnotic, a lullaby, promising solace after the chaos. For a moment, the seductive pull of her reassurance nearly overwhelmed me, but beneath the surface, a stubborn doubt stirred. "No, something's off. I can feel it. I don't know if I can trust you." In that instant, her eyes flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible glint that sent a chill racing down my spine. She stepped even closer, her smile widening in a manner that felt both inviting and menacing. "You're overthinking it, love. Let me help you. Just let go of your fears and accept this." The closer she came, the more I sensed an undercurrent of menace, a subtle distortion in her features, a lag in her movements that defied the natural flow of life. Instinct roared within me, urging escape. With a surge of adrenaline, I shoved her back. The act felt like a betrayal, even as it snapped me back to reality. In that charged moment, the air shattered with a sudden, bone-chilling crack. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that stretched like grasping fingers. As I staggered backward, my heart pounded in my ears, and from the far corner of the room, a dark, shifting presence emerged, a being whose form wavered between this world and some other far more sinister plane. Its eyes, voids of ancient malice, fixed upon me as it spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. You never left the waiting room. The walls convulsed as the sterile confines dissolved into a nightmare of swirling shadows and fractured time. I stood frozen, caught between the remnants of a reality I once knew and a terror that refused to relent. In that final, shattering moment, as the boundaries of my world crumbled into darkness, I realized that I had been waiting for myself in that waiting room all along, even before the chase and the chaos began, trapped in an endless cycle. Here I am, once again, sitting in that same cold waiting room. There's a moment in every life when desire becomes a burden, when a fleeting connection shifts into something darker, something irrevocable. The night is long, and its promises whisper only of truths no man should have to bear. And for David Cartwright, that night came to an end, not with a scream, but with silence. David had always been the type to chase the thrill. He was drawn to what was fleeting, to the faces in the crowd that promised nothing more than a passing fleeting glance, a kiss on the cheek, a night of seduction and satisfaction. He was the kind of man who lived for the moment, never asking what came after, never wondering if the bed he shared would become a tomb. Then one night he met her, Lana. She walked into his life as though she had always belonged to it, a whisper in the air, a shadow on the edge of his vision. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. She was alluring in a way that made the world seem irrelevant. It was her eyes, the way they caught the light, the way they saw him in a way no one else had. It was a night like any other. They met, they laughed, they talked, they kissed, and before long they were tangled together, lying in the warmth of each other's skin. But as their bodies merged, something shifted. The air grew heavy. Time, too slow, too swift, seemed to lose its meaning. There was a strange stillness in her, an absence of the normal warmth of human connection. As they lay together, Lana's eyes, dark and endless, kept darting to the clock on the wall, then back to him, then to the clock again. It was subtle at first, like a breath caught between heartbeats. Then it became obvious. She was counting the minutes, waiting for something. "Are you all right?" David asked, the words slipping out like the last remnants of his confidence. Lana Stett's smile was soft, but it didn't quite meet her eyes. "I am fine," she said, her voice like velvet, smooth, but with an edge of something he couldn't quite place. "I am just keeping track." "Of what?" he asked, half in jest, half in genuine confusion. She didn't answer. Her gaze shifted back to the clock, her lips parting slightly as though she were holding something back. Finally, with an air of finality, she looked at him again. "It's Set's time." David chuckled, thinking she was teasing, but there was no playfulness in her tone now. "Time for what?" "The baby," she murmured, as if the answer was as inevitable as the rising sun. His heart stuttered. "The baby?" She nodded, the mystery deepening in her eyes. "You don't understand yet, but you will." David sat up, his skin suddenly clammy. "What do you mean? What steps happening?" But before he could say another word, Lana rose from the bed, her body moving with a grace that was almost unreal. She walked toward the open terrace, her silhouette framed by the light that spilled through the door, a glow so bright it seemed to hum with a strange foreign energy. "Lana," he called, his voice thick with confusion, with fear. But she didn't turn back to him. Her eyes, though, glistened with something that seemed to be both sadness and certainty. "David," she called softly. The sound like a song in the wind. "In my world, men don't exist. We can only reproduce with creatures like you. And you stirred the one we needed." His chest tightened. the air in the room suddenly unbearable. "Why, I don't stead understand." "You will," she whispered, almost gently, "and when you do, it will be too late." And then, with a final glance, she stepped out into the light. The air around her shimmered as if it were bending, folding into something that wasn't quite of this world. Her figure vanished into the brilliance, and for a moment the room stood still as though time itself had been suspended. David staggered to his feet, his stomach turning. It was happening now. He could feel it, a strange, unnatural weight inside him, growing, twisting. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, and he fell to his knees as pain, sharp and unrelenting, tore through his body. It wasn't a birth, not in the way a man would know it. It was something else, a cruel imitation of life, a force beyond his understanding. He felt his body being pulled, stretched, split open in a way that shouldn't have been possible, shouldn't have been real. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was silent. David lay on the floor, his body still, too still. His chest didn't rise. His heartbeat had ceased. In the distance, outside the terrace, there was the faintest sound of something, footsteps, soft and fleeting, fading into the distance. It was Lana, and she was leaving. But not alone. She was carrying the child. Their child. There was no scream, no final cry of agony, just silence. And in that silence, David's body was left behind, an empty shell in a bed that had once held warmth and desire. The light from the terrace flickered, then vanished completely. The morning came slowly, quietly. By the time the sun had risen, the bed was empty, save for the faintest imprint of two bodies, one gone, the other unspoken. It would be days before anyone would discover him. But by then, David was no more than a whisper, a memory fleeting, like the night itself. And far above, in the vastness of the sky, a ship sailed across the stars, its mission complete, its purpose fulfilled. My fork hit the plate with a loud clank. I slowly finished chewing my bite, swallowed hard, and then uttered, "What? Fuck." The scale, the one that stuck to the wall in the bathroom when I flung it, I'd forgotten to pick it up. My throat tightened. I know it must have freaked you out, but they're for a model I'd been working on. A model. John, they felt real. Well, thanks, he chuckled. I'm trying to make them as lifelike as possible. I was still extremely skeptical. Why were they in your shaving kit, though? They weren't finished curing, and I didn't want them to get messed up, so I just tucked them into there. It seemed like a strange choice to me, but conceivable. John was a very smart man, though sometimes his logic and reasoning on certain things differed drastically from my own. Okay, well, what about the salt? I asked, deciding to just go for it now that the lines of communication had been opened. The salt? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, the cinnamon rolls you made, they were covered in salts. I had to throw them all away, and when I kissed you the other day, you tasted salty. He paused for a moment, took a deep breath, then looked down at his plate. I sweat a lot, Sonia. You know I've been working out more lately, too. I got up extra early and went for a run before I made those. God, I'm embarrassed now. So last night in bed, you're telling me that was just sweat, too? He looked back up at me, and his eyes softened. Yes, I was having a nightmare. Oh, Sonia, it was awful, and it felt so real. I was being drowned in the bathtub by some unseen force. I woke up drenched and confused, struggling to breathe. I tried to wake you up to help me, but you freaked out. I was still so disoriented that I couldn't explain that to you at the time. It all seemed so bizarre, but at the same time, just plausible enough to stop me in my tracks and force me to recalibrate. And if it were all true, I felt bad. I realized I had been so stuck in my own head that I hadn't even considered how he might have been feeling. Flipping around the perspective, it would actually be me who looked like the irrational one, throwing away the apology cinnamon rolls and crumpling up the note, screaming at him in bed and acting like he was a monster, sneaking around and collecting model fish scales to have them tested. God, no wonder they couldn't be identified. I felt absolutely ridiculous. I accepted his apology and his explanations, then told him I was sorry too, for how I'd reacted to things. We finished our food and the episode of Deadliest Catch in silence. Then John took my plate and told me not to worry about the dishes. He'd have them washed and put away by the time I got out of the shower. The bathroom was spotless. His shaving kit wasn't out, and the tub looked pristine, like it had been scrubbed clean and polished. Shit, it looked better than it did when we moved in. I smiled. It seemed like he was truly making a concerted effort to set things right between us. As I exited the bathroom in my robe, he came running down the hallway like a toddler, gleefully shouting, "My turn." I chuckled and rolled my eyes, then went off to bed to wait for him. He stayed in the bathroom showering for a long time, way longer than he normally did. When he finally emerged, he immediately crawled into bed with me and scooted his body close to mine, putting his arm around me and pulling me into an embrace. He was warm again. He was John again. I closed my eyes as he leaned in and whispered, "I love you, Sonia." I told him I loved him too. He gently kissed my cheek, then asked, "You want to spawn?" My eyes popped open and I slowly turned my face to see his big, cheesy smile looming over me. I let out a weak, nervous laugh, and he winks. It was just a joke, albeit a poorly timed one. But still on par with John's typical goofy sense of humor, I thought. The tension in my body began to fade away as he started running his hands softly across my skin. We made love passionately that night. It felt the way it did when we had first gotten together. Like all the magic between us was still very much alive. I peacefully drifted off to sleep in his arms, with my mind finally at ease. For a while, it truly seemed like I had gotten him back. The more normal he acted, the more sure I became that I had just been overreacting that whole time. I doubted my own judgment and perception, luring myself into believing the thing I wanted so desperately to be true. By the next week, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Then, one morning, everything changed. We were at the front door, grabbing our things from the coat closet and getting ready to leave for work, when I looked down and caught a glimpse of something odd. Lying just within view, sitting inconspicuously on the sole of his shoe, was a single strand of seaweed. No, my heart sunk. It wasn't one of those dried seaweed snacks they sell at the Asian market either. It looked slimy and wet, like it had just been dragged up from the water. Portions of the roots were still attached. I only had about a half second to process this information before he shoved his foot into the loafer. Fuck. He walks me to my car and kissed me goodbye. With clenched teeth, I forced a smile and drove away, looking at him through my rearview mirror. He stood there in the driveway and watched my car until I began to turn left at the stop sign at the end of our street. As soon as I was out of his sight, I punched hard on the gas. God damn it, I thought, slamming my hand onto the top of the steering wheel. Why? Why did I have to see that? Why did it have to be there? Things had finally gone back to normal, and now this. What the fuck? I drove to work in a silent state of panic, desperately trying to stop myself from spiraling. It's just a piece of seaweed, I told myself. It meant nothing. He could have been doing field research for the lab. Hell, there could be several perfectly rational explanations as to how it had gotten there. I mean, he was a marine biologist, and we lived in Bar Harbor, for Christ's sake. The ocean was 5 minutes from everywhere. It's not like seaweed was an uncommon thing to see around Maine. With as far as the tides drew back at the bay, it was practically expected. Things between us had been going so perfectly, better than they'd been in a while. Actually, I couldn't let this one little weird thing ruin all of that. I forced it to the back of my mind and tried to focus on my job. I had a report to finish on fishery management, and my boss was asking for progress updates daily. As the day went on, though, my mind began to wander. During my lunch break, I started Googling. Symptoms of psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, confused and disturbed thoughts. Okay, shit. That sounded like it could possibly apply to me, as much as it did to him. If I'm being honest, I wasn't entirely sure what was real and what I'd just been imagining. At that point, the only thing I was sure of was that one of us was experiencing delusions. Either John was losing his mind or I was. I can confirm that I was definitely experiencing the confused and disturbed thoughts part, though. Symptoms of a brain tumors, headaches, seizures, changes in mental function, mood, or personality. That one hit a little too close to home. I bit down on my bottom lip and hit the backspace button. Trying to diagnose him using WebMD would be impossible. It would also serve to further my paranoia. which was the last thing I needed at the time. I just have to keep watching him to see if any more symptoms appeared. I dug around in my Greek salad, chasing a Kalamata olive with my fork when a thought came to me. I typed marine hatchetfish into the search bar, living in depths of up to 4,000 feet. They looked about how you'd expect, hideous little things, with extremely large bulging eyes, a downturned gaping mouth full of tiny sharp teeth, and a grotesquely misshaped body. I remember thinking how terrifying these creatures would be if they weren't small enough to fit inside a human palm. Its scales were silver and delicate, just like John's model scales looked. If John was making the model, why would he choose such an ugly specimen, let alone one belonging to a genus that wasn't even remotely in his realm of studies? I suppose he could have taken a personal interest in this particular fish, but I still didn't understand why, so I kept reading. There are 7 documented species of Ardeuroplex, otherwise known as silver hatchetfish. Each species differs slightly in size and range, but they all share a few common traits. They feed on prey like small crustaceans, shrimp, and fish larvae, which they hunt by migrating to the surface at night. They utilize their disproportionately large pupils to detect even the faintest traces of light, and like many deep-sea fish, they possess bioluminescence. A set of tiny blue glowing lights emitting from their underbellies act to mimic rippling sunlight, concealing them from predators below, a nifty little evolutionary trick referred to as counter-illumination. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff, but I suppose I could see why John might have taken an interest in them. He'd always been particularly fascinated with bioluminescence. After all, you'd be hard-pressed to find a biologist who didn't at least agree that it was one of the most amazing natural phenomena to grace our planet. Maybe he was planning to attach tiny LED lights to his model. Shit, with it being almost December. Maybe he'd been working on this as a Christmas gift for someone, or perhaps even an ornament for our tree. I hoped. I slid my phone into my pocket and went back to work, determined to finish my report. At the very least, I needed to complete the first draft of it. I couldn't afford to let myself go overboard with all of these obsessive thoughts about what was going on in John's mind. I had my own career to focus on, my own damn life to live too. I was able to power through the conclusion of my report by the end of that afternoon. Not my best work, I'll admit, but it was something to show my boss the next day. John's vehicle was already in the driveway when I got home. I noticed that the gate to the backyard was open, and the hose was trailing around the corner of the house from the front spigot, but I didn't think much of it at that moment. I walked inside and saw his field bag lying on the floor in front of the coat closet. None of the lights had been turned on and the TV was off. "John?" I called out. No answer. I set my bag down on the floor next to his, and made my way to the kitchen. His keys and pocket change were sitting atop the island, but other than that, the room was exactly as we'd left it that morning. I thought back to the hose. Maybe he's gardening out in the backyard? Wait, in mid-November? No, Sonia, get it together. My persistent urge to explain away odd behaviors in order to maintain the status quo had begun to seriously damage my inductive reasoning skills. My search for him had to be put on pause, however, at the request of my bladder. I shuffled to the bathroom, flipped on the light, and hurried to the toilet to relieve myself. I flushed, washed my hands, then shut off the faucet. When I did, I could hear a drip coming from the bathtub, but it wasn't the plop sound that water makes when it hits a dry surface. It was the plunk, plunk, plunk you hear when it's dripping into more water below. My blood ran cold, and my hand began to tremble as I reached out toward the shower curtain. I inhaled a deep breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, then ripped the curtain back. There was John. He was just lying there, fully submerged and motionless, with his eyes closed and his arms folded across his chest. Large chunks of ice floated in the water surrounding his body. My heart stopped. I fell to my knees, screamed his name, and threw my arms out to grab him from the water. Then, his eyes popped open. His pupils were heavily dilated, covering almost the entire diameter of his iris, and he was looking at me so intensely it felt like his gaze pierced directly into the depths of my soul. I fell backward and started scrambling to secure a foothold on the fuzzy mat beneath me. As I tried desperately to stand back up, John's body began to rise from the water. The corners of his mouth began to slowly recede into a smile before he uttered, "Hey, Sonia, did I scare you?" I blinked a few times, completely dumbfounded by the audacity of this question. Then the visceral reaction I'd internalized suddenly bubbled over and erupted to the surface. "John!" I shrieked, and my voice began to break. "I thought you were fucking dead." He laughed. "Oh wow, Sonia. That's dramatic. I'm just doing a cold plunge." I rose to my feet, still in shock and trying to choke back the tears that had begun to flood my eyes. "What?" He stepped out of the tub and began toweling himself off. "Yeah. Howard from work told me it would help me go harder on my workouts. It actually feels great. You should try it," he said. "Fully clothed?" I yelled. "Well, yeah, Sonia. That's how you do it. You don't get naked like it's a regular bath," he giggled. I stared at him blankly until that stupid smile had left his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Geez, I had no idea that it would scare you. I'm sorry." I wasn't sure if I believed him or not, but that wasn't my focus at the time. I was upset and hurt. I wanted to scream and cry and beat my fists against his chest. How could he be so dismissive, so callous? But I knew at that moment, trying to convey those feelings to him would do no good. Neither would it be to continue to question him. "It's fine," I said. It most certainly was not fine, but I didn't want him to think otherwise. The panic hadn't yet left my body, and with it came a type of calculated behavior I can only attribute to pure survival instincts. I allowed him to think I'd gotten over it and started dinner. It was a Tuesday, so I was making tacos. Cliché, I know, but it was just one of my things. After he dried himself off and changed clothes, he came into the kitchen and sat down at the island. I didn't turn around to look at him. I just kept stirring the ground beef in the pan. "You know," he said. "I've been craving seafood lately." I froze in place, gripping tightly onto the wooden spoon. "Maybe next Tuesday we can have fish tacos. Or later this week we could try shrimp scampi," he continued. It took everything in me not to react, but I resumed stirring and replied, "Yeah, sure, that sounds good. I can look up some recipes." John never asked for seafood before. He'd eat it if offered, but it was never one of his favorites. Was he testing me? If so, I hoped I'd passed. We ate, watched TV, and then I went to the bathroom to shower. This was my chance. I turned on the faucet in the bathtub, locked the door, and then went straight for his shaving kit on the counter. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I unzipped the kit, being extremely careful not to disturb whatever contents were concealed inside. And yes, I found exactly what I feared I'd find. More scales. A lot of them. Silvery, delicate, but this time, dried. And horrifyingly, they were speckled with tiny red drops of what looked like blood. I leaned in closer and pulled out my phone to start taking pictures. When I zoomed in, I noticed that attached to the inner edge of each scale was a half ring of beige-colored tissue. Flesh, it was human flesh. Motherfucker, I dropped my phone and gripped the counter to steady myself, but the room was already spinning. I had to keep breathing. I had to move. I had to turn off the water. I ran over to the bathtub and shut it off right before it overflowed. Dark spots began to appear in my line of vision, and the blood drained from my face as an overwhelming wave of dizziness swept over my body. Fearing I was going to pass out, I lowered myself down onto the floor beside the tub and focused on the ripples in the water, trying to ground myself. The mystery white sediment had come back, lining every corner and crack of the tub. Little chunks of it were floating all over the surface. How could it have come back so quickly, and so much? I reached out and plucked the nearest chunk from the water. It was soft and started to crumble at the edges. Then, without thinking, I lifted it to my mouth and tasted it. Salt. My world felt as if it were closing in on me. It didn't matter how many times my mind repeated the word no, the facts remained. I couldn't wish this away. I felt broken and completely lost. There was nothing I could do except to try to go through the motions of the rest of the night. I bathed, got dressed, went to bed, and pretended to be asleep. It took about an hour for him to crawl into bed next to me, then another to confirm he was sleeping. As soon as he started snoring, I rolled over in bed to face him, then lifted the covers and looked down at his body. I need to check, I thought. Holding my breath, I reached out and gently lifted the back of his shirt, disrupting his breathing pattern and causing him to shift slightly. I let go, but scooted closer. Being caught inspecting his body that way would throw up alarms that I was onto him, but using my hands to do it under the ruse of cuddling wouldn't. I thought. I put my arm around him, resting it on his side. He didn't react, so I slid my hand underneath his shirt and started slowly moving it around his back, searching for any anomaly. His skin was ice cold again, and clammy, almost rubbery. Other than that, I didn't feel anything else strange, so I slowly moved down to his hip. When I got there, I froze. Something instantly felt wrong, like very wrong. His pelvic bone. It seemed to have somehow started to shift from its natural upright position to tilting downward. I pulled my hand away and quickly turned back over to face my alarm clock. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I didn't sleep. Instead, I resumed my endless loop of thoughts. And in those thoughts, I finally stumbled upon a tiny speck of clarity drifting within a sea of confusion. I couldn't continue to live in this little fantasy land pretending everything was perfect, no matter how much I wanted to. What I needed was to be logical. I needed to look at this from a scientific perspective. Step 1. Form a theory. I think my husband is a fucking fish person. Step 2. Collect evidence in hopes of disproving said theory. At exactly 4:44 a.m., John stopped snoring. I shut my eyes tightly and waited as he got up and went to the bathroom. He spent about 20 minutes in there, doing God knows what, then immediately left the house. When I heard his engine start out front, I shot up and ran to the window. Then I watched his headlights trail down the street until he got to the stop sign. He didn't take a left into town. Instead, he took a right, headed toward the ocean. I ran to the front door, grabbed my keys and a coat, then shoved my feet into the first pair of shoes I could find. The harsh, cold night air hit me like a steamship, nearly knocking me over. I pulled the hood up over my head and scurried to my car, then tore down Hancock Street after him. A rush of adrenaline began surging through my body as I got closer and closer to the coast. Squinting through the darkness of the deserted street, I looked around in all directions, frantically trying to locate his vehicle, until I spotted it, parked just outside the house of a local artist. The short path ahead was closed for the winter, so I turned down Devilstone Way, made a U-turn to face the end of the road, and cut my lights off. Although the thought crossed my mind, my gut told me that he wasn't inside that house. I got out of my car, leaving it running, and started walking toward the bay. I ducked under the large beach closed sign and continued until I was a few feet away from the rocky coastline. That's when I saw him, the dark silhouette of my husband, standing still at the water's edge, staring directly out into the abyss, and completely nude. My heart began thrashing against my chest, like a fish caught in a net. I lowered myself behind a large rock and watched on in horror through the fog as he slowly began walking, straight into the fucking ocean. I stood there paralyzed with terror as his head sunk below the surface. Only a few seconds passed before he breached, biting down hard on a lobster that was squirming within the confines of his jaws. Holy fuck. My mind was unable to process what I was truly witnessing. Instinct took over, and my hand shot up, covering my mouth to stifle my scream. I turned around and ran full speed back to my car. I didn't look behind me, I was too afraid. I just kept running and praying to God that he hadn't seen me. I threw the car in drive and booked it home, knowing he would be making his way back there any minute now that he'd had his breakfast. I gagged, but I didn't have the time to be squeamish. The clock was ticking. I had to come up with a plan, and fast. Shit. Why couldn't I have married a nice, boring accountant? When I got back inside the house, I slammed the door shut and looked down at John's field bag sitting on the floor next to the coat closet. I knew I only had seconds to spare, so I went straight for the side pocket where I knew he kept his flash drives. It was the only chance I had to maybe find out just what exactly I was dealing with here. I reached inside and dug around. Yes, my fingers met one, just as I heard the brakes of his Jeep Wrangler squeal. I grabbed the drive and hurried to the bedroom, jumping into bed and throwing the covers over myself. The front door latch closed and I struggled to slow my breathing to an even steady pace. I couldn't even begin to tell you the horrific thoughts that crossed my mind as I lay there. Helpless. He never entered the bedroom though, just went through his normal morning routine, whatever that meant, then left for work. I didn't know if he'd seen me. Hell, a part of me didn't even care. Things couldn't continue this way. After what I'd just seen, it was impossible. Yet John somehow always seemed able to quickly conjure up an excuse for every outlandish behavior he displayed thus far. Confronting him using only words wasn't an option. I needed irrefutable evidence, even more than I'd already collected. I called my boss, telling him I was sick and that I wouldn't be able to make it into work. He'd just have to wait one more day for that report. I had bigger fish to fry. I grabbed the laptop from my field bag and sat down at the island. Booting it up and inserting the flash drive with shaking hands. I hesitated for a moment before opening the file. Did I really want to know the truth? Was I truly ready to open up this can of worms? I knew that from this point on, there was no going back. I inhaled slowly, deeply, then clicked. The top of the page read, MDI Biological Laboratory, pioneering new approaches in regenerative medicine. Fuck. Jessica was right. Should I call her? No, I can't. She made it clear she didn't want to be involved. I was on my own with this. With bated breath, I scrolled on. What followed was a wall of text filled with scientific jargon. I'll spare you the complicated details and summarize the best I can in layman's terms. Researchers were able to create synthetic bioluminescence systems by modifying a specific enzyme called luciferase using a process known as directed evolution. This allowed for use in various applications, including the deep organs and tissues of other living animals. Yes, you did read that correctly. There are more than 40 known bioluminescent systems in the natural world, but only 11 of them have been able to be recreated and utilized by scientists with this specific technology. A new research project was formed in hopes of discovering how to manipulate and synthesize other bioluminescent systems, including those containing icaurin, the photoprotein responsible for creating blue light. Oh, my fucking God. I slammed the laptop shut. It all made sense. The clammy skin, the salt everywhere, the cold plunges, the lobster. Christ, all of it. Son of a bitch. I wondered what else I'd missed, and started tearing the house apart, looking for more evidence. I'm well aware that I'd already collected more than enough in support of my theory. What I was looking for, secretly wishing for, was anything that might prove me wrong. Instead, I found more dried up fish scales tucked away in different drawers all over the house. I found salt lining the corners of the floors, crusting to the edges of the baseboards. In the bathroom trash can were several shrimp heads, hidden underneath wads of slimy toilet paper. I remembered the hose and went out to the backyard to see what he'd been doing. A giant hole had been dug in the middle of our yard and filled with water, creating an enormous mud pit that spanned almost the entire length of the fence line. A dozen or so empty bags of aquarium salt lay discarded on the grass beside it. I knew with every fiber of my being, but I still needed to hear him say it. It was the only way I'd have any chance of helping him. I was convinced that this had to have been some sort of horrible accident. He'd gotten involved with this sketchy research somehow, and maybe he'd cut himself while handling some of the genetic material. If I could just find a way to force him into telling me what had happened, if I could back him into a corner to where he could no longer deny it, then maybe together we could try to reverse whatever was going on with his body. Or, at the very least, stop it from getting any worse. I hoped. I walked inside the house, sat down at the laptop, and went back to the very first thing I'd researched when all of this crazy shit started: hatchetfish. And then, with about 4 hours until he arrived back home from work, I formed a hypothesis and devised a plan. Tuna, one of the top predators in the ocean, an unsuspecting killer lurking in the depths of the Atlantic. The local seafood market had it on sale that week. Freshly cut tuna steaks for $10.99 per pound. I drove into town and purchased 2 large steaks, along with the ingredients needed to make a lemon caper sauce. Then I sped back home with my thoughts racing. I needed once and for all to expose him for the Fishman. I knew he was. To provoke a response so extreme, so undeniable, it would be impossible for him to hide or explain away. I looked down at my watch, 3:41 p.m. A little more than an hour left. The food would take almost no time at all to prepare, so I used the remaining moments I had alone to go through our wedding album. I sat down on the couch with tears forming behind my eyes as I reflected on how happy that day was for us. Best day of our lives. The last 5 years with him had truly been so perfect. I couldn't understand why or even how it had all gone so wrong so quickly. All I knew was that I had to try to fix this. I had to get John back. I sunk down into the cushions and began hugging the throw pillow beside me. Suddenly my phone vibrated, jolting me back into an upright position. Headed home. Go time. I shut the photo album, wiped my eyes, then made my way to the kitchen. I started on the sauce first, throwing it together in about 10 minutes, and remembering to set aside a few lemon wedges to use as garnish. Then I started searing the tuna, 1.5 minutes on each side. I set 2 plates out on the island, and took in a deep breath as I heard him pull into the driveway. My entire body was shaking, but I knew I had to try to stay calm. I couldn't risk spooking him before he was in position. "Hey," he said with a confused smile as he entered the kitchen. Standing strategically in front of the pan on the stove, I replied, "Hey, John, I've got a surprise for dinner tonight." He sat down and sniffed at the air intensely. Then he stopped, and the smile slowly faded from his face. His Adam's apple bounced upward as he swallowed hard, and his pupils began to dilate. "What is it?" he asked nervously. I grabbed the pan from the stove and quickly plopped one of the steaks down onto the plate in front of him. "Tuna," I said. He looked down at it, and his eyes widened. As I began to pour the sauce over his steak, his nostrils flared and he began breathing heavily. I squeezed a bit of juice from the lemon wedge around his plate, but I was so focused on watching him for a reaction that I accidentally squirted a droplet into his eye. He didn't flinch. Instead, 2 vertical-facing inner eyelids quickly slid from each corner, meeting in the middle with a squish. My mouth fell open and I gasped. I dropped the wedge and ripped my hand away, but before I could even fully react to that horror, another began to unfold in front of me. On his stomach, underneath his button-up Hawaiian shirt, a set of 6 tiny blue lights began to glow. I jumped backward, tripping on the bar stool next to me and hitting the ground hard. I quickly scrambled back up to my feet using the island for leverage, then pointed my finger at John and screamed. I fucking knew it. His expression remained neutral as he looked down at his glowing belly, then back up at me. I'd finally caught him. No way he was going to be able to wriggle his way off this hook. There was nothing he could say, nothing he could do. Now he'd have to admit to me what was truly going on. "Sonia, I'm dying." Those 3 words took the wind right out of my sails. My chest tightened and my arm dropped back down to my side. "What?" His head hung low as he pushed the plate away from himself and whispered, "I thought I had more time, but nothing I've tried has worked." "John, tell me what happened to you," I demanded. He took in a deep breath, then began to speak. "Back when this all started, I never thought it would go this far. During the first few weeks, I quickly began to realize that some of the changes were, well, more than I'd bargained for. Sonia, I swear, I tried to stop it. I tried to fix it, but I couldn't keep myself from going back. I don't know, I started to like it." "John, are you telling me you did this to yourself? On purpose?" He looked up at me and a single black tear escaped from his eye, trailing down the side of his cheek. "I didn't know what would happen," he said, his voice trembling with shame. "Well, it stops now," I screamed. He slowly stood up from the bar stool and placed his hand on my shoulder. Looking into my eyes, he said, "It's too late. John, please, we have to tell someone. We have to at least try to get you help," I begged. He shook his head, his face sullen and streaked with more black stains. "I've taken too many doses. The effects are irreversible at this point. I've been trying to do everything I can to make living on land more comfortable for myself, so I could stay here with you, but it's becoming increasingly unbearable by the minute. I'm so sorry, Sonia. I wanted to tell you. I really did, but I just couldn't. Please, please forgive me." At that moment, the earth stopped spinning. All sound escaped from the room, and I was left only with the deafening thud of my heartbeat flooding my ears. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't cry. I just stood there, frozen and hollow, as all the pieces of this puzzle finally snapped into place, and my entire world crumbled around me. My knees buckled, and I fell forward into his arms. Somehow I allowed myself to forgive him for what he had done to himself, for committing this act of betrayal that cut so deeply. He hadn't done it to hurt me. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. That was just John. We embraced each other tightly for a few minutes, before I was able to finally work up the courage to ask him, "What do we do now?" The answer was simple, but far from easy. In fact, it would be the hardest thing I'd ever have to do in my life, for many reasons, and I didn't know if I had the heart to bear it. This choice would be one of the most devastating decisions a person could be asked to make, And yet I agreed. I'm at the cove now, watching the dark waves violently crash against the rocks, letting the cold breeze sweep across my face as the sun sets on the horizon. I'm gonna end this by saying, I love my husband. I truly do. I'll try to come back here to visit him whenever I can, but I cannot watch him slowly die in our house. I can't be selfish like that. It isn't about what I want. It's about what he needs. And I know deep down in my heart, the right thing to do for him is to let him go. My job was to preserve and protect coastal ecosystems. But today, instead of a report, I'll be handing in my resignation to anyone reading this. I'm so sorry. But the truth is, I have no idea what I've just released into that water and unleashed onto the world. I'm gonna start this by saying I love my husband. I truly do. He didn't start out like this. We've been married for about 5 years now. Up until this point, blissfully so, I might add. I met John at a party during our first year of college. Biology major, like me. He seemed to say all the right things, knew all the right people, and he was quite attractive. We clicked immediately. After only one conversation, I'd fallen hard for him. Hook, line, and sinker. It wasn't long before we were dating. It all happened so fast. In a whirlwind of a year, we went from being introduced, to moving in together, to engaged, and then married. In hindsight, I know I moved too quickly, but it didn't feel that way at all. It was like I'd known him forever. I was never so sure of anything, as I was that John was my soulmate. The first indication that something was wrong came about a month ago. I'd woken up from a dead sleep in the middle of the night to the sound of running water. Looking over, I noticed John wasn't in bed, so I got up to go look for him. I found him in the kitchen. He was standing at the sink, and as I crept closer, I could see that he was just staring blankly at the water pouring from the faucet. I reached out my hand and gently placed it on his shoulder, inadvertently breaking his trance and causing him to recoil back like a snake. Shit! Oh honey, I'm sorry, I said. He didn't reply. He just began wiping his face and gasping, trying to catch his breath. Was he sleepwalking? He'd never done that before. John, are you okay? What in the hell were you doing? I asked, reaching over to shut the faucet off. I don't know, he stammered. Guess I was thirsty. John was always such a smart-ass, in a playful way of course, but I could still tell he was rattled by it. It seemed like he had zero recollection of how he'd gotten there. However, in the moment, I tried to shrug it off and shuffled him back into bed. I had work early the next morning, and I knew if I stayed up any longer, I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep. I cuddled up next to him, trying to settle back down into slumber, when I noticed John's body felt a little cold. He must be coming down with something, I thought. Or maybe my cooking had made him queasy, and he just didn't want to say anything. I closed my eyes for what felt like only a second before my alarm clock began screaming at me. The next morning played out normally. We ate breakfast together, got dressed, then headed off on our separate ways. In fact, the next few mornings went just that way. He didn't seem sick. It didn't seem like there was anything wrong at all. It wasn't until almost a week later that the next incident occurred. John had come home late from work that day. As I made dinner, he walked into the kitchen looking stressed out and distracted, like he had a problem in his mind that he was desperately trying to work out. Not really an odd occurrence in and of itself, though he'd often bring his work home with him. But this time he looked distraught, almost upset. Hey, you all right? I asked him. He slumped down onto the bar stool and leaned his body forward, resting his elbows on the island. He began rubbing his temples. Yeah, just I have a headache, he said. Oh, I'll get you some Advil. No, it's okay. You finish what you're doing. I can get it. I smiled and walked from the stove over to him, leaning over the island to kiss his forehead. When my lips met his skin, I was shocked by two things. One, he was ice cold to the touch. It was like kissing a refrigerator. And two, I was immediately hit with the bitter taste of salt. Reflexively, I pulled away. Then he looked up at me, his eyes slightly bloodshot and cradled by dark circles. You're getting sick, I said. Sonia, I'm not getting sick. I'm fine. It's just a headache. I threw my hands up in frustration. I can't afford to catch whatever you've got. John, you know how much I have going on at work right now. Suddenly, he slammed his fist down on the island, so hard that it rattled the keys and pocket change sitting beside him, then yelled, "You don't think I have a lot going on right now, too?" My heart dropped, and I shuddered, instantly taking a step backward. He'd never done anything like that before. Hell, he'd never even raised his voice at me. I didn't know how to react, but I didn't have much time to think about it before he started apologizing profusely, saying he didn't know what had come over him. I accepted it as an isolated incident, though. Just an outburst caused by a combination of stress and illness. I thought, after all, I'd heard that men turn into babies when they get sick. I didn't cuddle up to him in bed that night, though. Not just because I was worried about him being contagious. I was also pissed off. I faced my night table and stared at my alarm clock for a while, wondering if we'd just been in the honeymoon phase all this time, and now the real John was starting to come out. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of cinnamon rolls. My favorite. I glanced over at the clock. 5:41 a.m. John must have felt so bad about his tantrum the night before that he'd gotten up early to surprise me with breakfast in bed. I pulled the covers closer to me and smiled, waiting anxiously with my eyes closed. Suddenly jolted back into consciousness by my alarm, I realized I must have fallen back asleep. I slammed my hand onto the top of it, frantically searching with my fingers for the off button. I squinted at the blurry red numbers. 6 a.m. It was time to get up, and he still hadn't come. Maybe things didn't go quite as smoothly as planned, and he was in the midst of some type of kitchen mishap. I threw the covers off of my body and made my way to the bathroom. As I passed the counter, I glanced down and noticed his shaving kit was out. He'd always leave it on the bathroom counter every morning after he used it, and I'd always put it away. He must have gotten up really early. I grabbed the kit and shoved it back into the drawer on my way out. While walking down the hallway, I called out to him, but he didn't answer. I turned the corner to discover the kitchen was empty. A tray of cinnamon rolls sat on top of the stove, untouched. I said his name a few more times, but nothing. I shuffled over to the front window of our house and looked toward our driveway. He was gone. What the fuck? I went back into the kitchen to find a note left on the island. "Sonia, I'm so sorry for last night. I had to go into work early this morning, so I wanted you to wake up to something almost as sweet as me. Love always, John." I rolled my eyes and smirked. He was still the same John. I was just overthinking things. I mean, it was only natural at this stage of our relationship that we'd start seeing parts of each other emerge that we hadn't seen before. I shoved a cinnamon roll into my mouth, and then began looking for a Tupperware to put the rest away. As I chewed, my taste buds began to detect a flavor that had no business being in a cinnamon roll, causing me to wince. Salt. I spat the bite out into the sink. Did he accidentally use salt instead of sugar? I went to the trash can to throw away the roll I'd bitten into, and saw the empty Pillsbury canister sitting on top. Okay, so he didn't make them himself. Why in the hell did he add salt to them? Was this a joke? Is that what he meant in the note by as sweet as me? I walked back over to the stove and tasted another cinnamon roll. Then another, and another. All of them full of salt. Some of them even felt soggy, like they'd been dipped in salt water. For Christ's sake. I threw the whole batch into the trash can, annoyed. We couldn't really afford to be wasting food like this, especially for a stupid prank. I crumpled up the note and started getting ready for work. That afternoon, I'd already decided I was going to confront him about those goddamn salty cinnamon rolls when he got home. I didn't find it to be funny at all. In fact, the more I thought about it throughout the day, the more it pissed me off. What on earth would possess him to do something like that? By 7 p.m., dinner was ready, and he still hadn't arrived. I was starting to get worried. I called his cell phone, but he didn't answer. Instead, he texted back almost instantly. "Hey, sorry. Super busy right now. I'll be home soon." Did he know I was angry and was just avoiding me? He was well aware that would only make it worse. I made myself a plate and plopped down on the couch, flipping through the channels before landing on some nature documentary on the Discovery Channel. By the time I'd finished eating, he still hadn't come home. I glanced down at my phone. No texts or calls. I got up, shut off the TV, and threw my plate into the sink. I left the rest of the food out on the stove and headed to the bathroom to shower, annoyed. He can just deal with it all himself whenever he decides to come home, I thought. When I walked into the bathroom, something stopped me in my tracks. His shaving kit. It was sitting out on the counter again. I was 100% positive I'd put it back in the drawer that morning. He had come home at some point during the day and shaved again. My heart fell to the bottom of my feet. There was no way John wouldn't cheat on me. He just wouldn't. But why would he need to shave again in the middle of the day? And why was he so late getting home from work? I stared down at the shaving kit, almost angry with it for being there. I decided not to put it away this time. I'll admit, I cried in the shower, just a little. Seems ridiculous now, to have cried over something like that. I didn't have proof of anything, just an inkling that something was off. But I can't blame myself for that moment of weakness. I didn't know what I didn't know. I couldn't have. I washed my face and composed myself, then reached down to grab my razor. When I did, I noticed there seemed to be this strange buildup forming around the edges of the bathtub. It was like a white, gritty sediment. I looked down at the drain, and it was starting to crust up right there too. Gross. Must be calcium buildup. I'll have to pick up some cleaner at the store, I thought. I got out of the shower and got dressed, glaring at the shaving kit. I didn't even go into the kitchen to see if he'd made it home yet. I just went straight to bed and started scrolling through YouTube until I found some mindless video to keep me company. It was my intention to stay awake until I heard him come in, but sleep found me much faster than I expected. It wasn't until I felt movement beside me that I realized he'd finally made it in. I squinted through the pitch-black room, trying to read the numbers on the clock, when I began to feel the icy cold drip of liquid landing on the side of my face. I slowly turned to see my husband leaning over me. His eyes were lifeless and glassed over, his mouth was downturned and hung open, and he was completely fucking drenched in water. I screamed and threw the covers off, flying out of bed to the other side of the room. "John, what the fuck?" His mouth was still hanging wide open, but he wasn't saying anything. He was just, well, it sounded like he was gurgling. Horrified, I flipped the light on, and he instantly covered his face with his hands. "John, what is going on?" I screamed. "Why are you all fucking wet?" He removed his hands from his face and blinked several times while looking down at his body, then mumbled. "Shit, I must have not dried off enough before I got into bed." "Dried off? From what?" "The shower." "The fucking shower?" He looked like he had just fully submerged himself in water and then immediately got into bed. A huge wet spot in the sheets surrounded him, and droplets of water were still trickling down his face from his soaked hair. "What? That doesn't make any sense," I yelled. He shot up from the bed and whipped the comforter onto the floor behind him. "Jesus Christ, Sonia." I get home late from work, exhausted, and now I gotta explain why I'm wet. My throat tightened, and I looked at him with complete and utter shock. I actually questioned if I was dreaming this. "John, you're scaring me." He stood there for a moment, his fists balled up and his chest convulsing with heavy breaths, before saying, "I'm going to sleep on the couch tonight. Sorry I scared you." He picked up his dripping pillow and stomped out of the room, shutting the door behind him. I had gone from angry at him to disturbed to downright terrified. He was having some kind of psychotic break. That was the only logical explanation for all of this. The increased pressure at work was getting to him. Or maybe he had a brain tumor? Oh God. Either way, something was seriously wrong. This was so beyond anything in the realm of normal that I just couldn't let it go. I mean, if I had $1 for every time my husband crawled into bed with me while soaking wet, well, I'd have $1, which is still too fucking many. I put new sheets on the bed, then crept over to the bedroom door and pressed my ear up to it. His snoring echoed through the silent house. I crawled back into bed with only a couple hours until it would be time to get up. There was no way I'd be able to fall back asleep after all of that, but I didn't know what else to do with myself besides lie there in the dark and think as I listened to the rhythmic sounds of his obnoxious mouth breathing coming from the next room. There was no way around it. John was going to have to go see a doctor. I just wasn't sure how I was going to get him to do that, considering how touchy he was about the subject of being sick, and not to mention his sudden, unpredictable, and strange behavior. If I couldn't convince him with words, there was no way I could physically force him to go, especially not now. I tossed and turned, trying to rationalize in some way what was going on. My scientific mind couldn't help it, but my specialty didn't focus on the human brain, or on humans at all actually. It was coastal ecology, Basically, my job consisted of studying and working to protect the entire ecosystem of our coasts. My husband's wheelhouse was marine biology. He worked as an entry-level research assistant in a lab. We were both extremely logical, sound-minded people before all of this. I can't stress that enough. At around 5 a.m., I heard his snoring stop abruptly. My heart began pounding in my chest, and I quickly turned over, pulling the blanket up to cover my face. There I was, so afraid of my own damn husband that I was pretending to be asleep just to avoid interacting with him. I listened to his heavy footsteps approaching the bedroom, then a pause, followed by the slow creak of the door opening. Terrified to move a muscle, I held my breath and my entire body instinctively locked up, like when a cuttlefish spots a shark. I couldn't see his eyes on me though. I felt them. The door began to creak again until I heard it latch back closed. Only problem was, I wasn't sure if he was outside of the room or not. I couldn't believe where I'd found myself. If someone had ever told me that one day I'd be hiding under the covers for my husband like a child afraid of the boogeyman, I would have laughed, then told them to fuck off. The toilet flushed from the bathroom across the hall, and I finally let out the breath I'd been so desperately holding. I still didn't get up though. Over the next hour, I listened to him shower, shave, and get ready for work, all while I lay there like a hermit crab who'd recoiled into its shell. When I finally heard the front door close and his engine start, I jumped up from bed and ran to the bathroom. I'd had to pee for so long I thought I was going to explode. I sat on the toilet, rubbing my eyes as they adjusted to the light, when I caught sight of something shiny in my peripheral vision. But when I turned to look, I didn't see anything. I walked up to the mirror and began inspecting myself. I looked like absolute shit. Not even the best concealer in the world was going to cover up those dark circles. I turned on the faucet to start washing my face and noticed John's shaving kit sitting out. Out of habit, I picked it up. When I did, I hadn't noticed it had been left open, so the contents came spilling out onto the floor. Shit. I bent down to begin picking everything up and immediately froze. On the ground, scattered amongst his razor, shaving cream, and aftershave lotion, was about a handful's worth of silvery iridescent fish scales. I stared down at the ground, suspended in motion, as my brain scrambled to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Had there been a gas leak in the house, and John and I had both been hallucinating this whole time? That would have explained a lot, actually. Slowly, I reached out my hand to touch one of them, just to make sure it was real. Not only was it real, it didn't feel like you'd expect a discarded fish scale to feel. It wasn't thin, or rigid, or even brittle. Instead, it had this strange, soft, rubbery texture to it, and it was slimy, like it was fresh. "Oh, hell no," I shrieked, flinging the scale across the room. It went flying and stuck to the wall when it hit. The sensation of it lingered long after it left my fingers. I felt disgusted, like I wanted to crawl out of my skin. My thoughts raced as I scrubbed my hands with Dial several times. What could he possibly be keeping these for? He must have taken them home from work and thought his shaving kit was his briefcase. But no. Why would he have them just loose like that? The lab wouldn't have even let them leave the area without being in a specimen bag, at least. Unless he'd snuck them out? Why would he do that? My head was spinning. It was all too much. I walked out of the bathroom, leaving everything on the floor where it had fallen. As I started getting dressed for work, I came to the obvious conclusion that I had to start investigating. I couldn't just sit around and wait for the next bizarre event to take place. Things were escalating, and quickly, for both my sake and John's. I needed to take action. I could try to get a look at his phone, but who knows when I'd get that chance. There was only one thing I knew for sure I could accomplish that day. I went over to my field bag and dug out a pair of gloves and a plastic specimen container. Then I went back to the bathroom and carefully collected a few of the scales on the floor. I picked up John's things, including the remaining scales, and shoved them all back inside the kit. I threw my gloves into the trash, then placed the shaving kit onto the counter, unzipped and exactly where it was before. I didn't want him to know what I had found. My starting point was finding out exactly what type of fish the scales had come from. That might point to why he had them in the first place. I'll be honest, even though it seemed like I was looking for logic in the decision-making of a madman, I felt like I had to do something. When I got to work, I went straight over to Jessica's station. I glanced around to make sure no one else was in earshot, then said, "Hey, I need you to do me a weird favor, unofficially." She smirked and said, "Okay, tell me what it is first." Then I'll tell you if I'll do it. I took a quick look around the room again, then reached into my bag and pulled out the scales, holding them out toward her. I need you to run an eDNA PCR analysis on these. She looked down at the container in my hand and raised an eyebrow. Where'd you find them? She asked. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. All right, spill it. What's going on, Sonia? I clenched my teeth, then leaned closer to her and whispered, I found them in John's stuff. I'm guessing he must have taken them home from work, but I don't know why. Seriously, Sonia, I'm swamped with a backlog of water samples to get through today, and you want me to spend a few hours doing this? What? You think he's trying to smuggle out some forbidden fish scales to sell on the black market or something? She laughed. Jessica, look, I'm seriously freaked out, okay? The words came out more frantic than I'd intended, my voice beginning to tremble. Her facial expression instantly shifted in response to my tone. What's going on? She asked. Honestly, I don't know. John's just been acting really weird lately, and then this morning, I found these. I'm just trying to figure out if he's hiding something, or if I need to make him an appointment with a neurologist. Her hand shot up to cover her mouth. Oh God, she whispered, looking off and pausing for a moment before asking. Weird like how? Just not his normal self. I didn't want to even begin to try to explain what had been going on. It would make me look just as crazy as it would him. But if I could just help John, if I could find a way to fix whatever was going on with him before anyone found out about it, then I'd never have to. We could just go back to how things were before and forget any of this ever happened. A few hours later, I looked up from my station to see Jessica standing over me with a very serious look on her face. We need to talk. I gulped hard. Shit. What had she discovered? Whatever it wasn't good, judging by her worried expression and hurried pace. I followed her back to her station, my heart pounding in synchrony with every step I took. What did you find? I asked. Nothing, she replied. That's the problem. What? Sonia, I can't identify these scales. They don't originate from any known species in the database, living or extinct. The closest comparison I can make is possibly something from the Sternoptechidae family, but these scales are much bigger. She handed me a piece of paper, and I glared down at it in disbelief. 5 scales, 5 tests, and each result came back as a sample of unknown origin. The implications of this were unnerving, to say the least, and the family of fish she had referred to. When I researched it later at my desk, I learned that it mainly consisted of species of deep-sea hatchetfish. John didn't even study those types of fish. He dealt exclusively with marine life that inhabited the apelagic zone, where light could still easily penetrate the ocean's surface. Hatchetfish were from the mesopelagic zone, also known as the twilight zone. That was about right. I was no closer to having any type of answer. In fact, by digging into this, I had only brought about more questions for myself. I don't understand how this is possible, I said. She looked at me with concern and lowered her voice. Does John have any connections to experimental labs, or possibly even a biotech company? She asked. What? No, of course not. Well, whatever he's working on, it's not mainstream. I can tell you that much. I took a deep breath. Maybe John wasn't losing his mind after all. Maybe he'd gotten himself involved in something unsavory or even illegal, and he's been trying to cover it up. Maybe all that crazy shit was just to throw me off or distract me. Please don't tell anyone about this, okay? I begged her. Shit, you don't have to ask me twice. No offense, Sonia, but I'd rather not be involved. Anyway, this is encroaching on fringe territory. That word scared me. Fringe. John was obsessed with his work. Once he found a thread, he'd pull at it relentlessly until he reached the spool. If he had fixated on something unconventional, well, there was no telling how far he'd take it. I spent the rest of the day agonizing over what I should do next. I couldn't focus on my work at all. Every time I saw my boss, I'd hurry and pretend like I was in the middle of something, when in reality I didn't accomplish a damn thing that day. That included figuring out my next move. After work, I sat in my car in the parking lot until about 6 p.m., paralyzed with inaction. Nothing I thought of seemed to be the right choice. If I confronted him about any of it, God knows how he'd react. On the other hand, If I just didn't say anything at all, he'd think he was getting away with whatever he'd been doing and continue. Suddenly, I felt a buzzing coming from my back pocket. It was a text from John. Working late? It said. Shit! Time's up. I steadied my hands and texted back. On my way now. I drove home completely on autopilot. You know those drives where you end up at your destination with no memory of actively driving to get there? My mind was completely elsewhere. This was my last chance to come up with any plan of action, but instead, my thoughts played on an endless loop, each one bleeding into the next. I took a deep breath and got out of the car. At the front door, as I turned the knob, I made the last-minute decision to just wing it. I didn't know what I was walking into, so how could I even begin to try to prepare for it anyway? As a rule, I preferred to be proactive rather than reactive, but in this case, I didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. I threw out any hope of strategy and resigned myself to respond accordingly to whatever stimuli befell me. As I walked inside, I was instantly hit with the rich aroma of tomatoes and garlic, something Italian. He knew it was my favorite. I slowly shut the door behind me. As soon as I did, he cheerfully called out from the kitchen. Hey Sonia, can you smell what the John is cooking? That stupid joke. The few times he actually did cook, he always pulled that one out. Never got a laugh out of me. But he never quit trying. Yeah, John, I can smell it, I replied, humoring him. At least he was in a good mood, I thought. Best not to rock the boat. My heart was still pounding, but so far things seemed normal. I put my bag down in the coat closet and shut the door to it, then made my way down the hall and into the kitchen. He'd made a huge mess, but he looked so proud of himself, smiling and wearing his goofy-ass kiss, the chef apron. Spaghetti? I asked, sitting down at the island. Nope, I did you one better. Lasagna? He exclaimed. No way. Wow, that must have taken you forever. It wasn't too bad. Just had to watch a couple YouTube videos. It should be ready to come out of the oven any minute now. I just looked at him and smiled. It felt so good to have John back. He seemed so happy and carefree, cracking jokes and trying to wipe the splatters of red sauce from the walls before they dried. For a moment, I let all my dread and worry fall away and settle in the furthest corners of my mind. I just wanted things to be normal again, so badly. I know I've been acting a little weird lately, he said, jolting all of those feelings back to the forefront in an instant. I swallowed hard. And I'm really sorry for that, he continued. Should I confront him now? Was this my opening to start asking him questions? I didn't want to kill the mood, but this seemed like my only chance. I opened my mouth, and then the kitchen timer went off. Oh, it's ready. Let's see how I did. Why don't you go find us something to watch? I'll make you a plate and bring it in there. Okay, I replied. I went into the living room and flipped on the TV, surfing until I landed on Old Reliable. A rerun of Deadliest Catch was on. He walked in and handed me my plate of lasagna soup. He hadn't let it set before he cut into it, so the contents had bled out all over the plate, but it still tasted just fine. He sat down beside me on the sofa with his own plate, then looked over at me and eagerly asked, So how is it? Really good, I mumbled through a mouthful of pasta and sauce. A huge toothy grin stretched across his face, and he said, I know you found my scales, Sonia.